Okay, we should be good now. That is so weird. Okay, we should be good. What I was saying is Matt Blackburn on his podcast had both of us on not too long ago, and I listened to yours, which was excellent. And you were talking to him about the doing lessons on mitochondrial respiration, and I was like, oh man, I haven't talked to Kyle for a while. I should have him on. We should go over mitochondrial respiration. We should talk about carnivore, low-carb diets like we always do, and just shoot the shit. So how are you, sir?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Pretty good. Can't complain, except for our audio issue. Yeah, so just before we get too deep into it, we have or I do live streams on this channel every other Friday at 6 p.m. And that schedule got a little screwed up because Georgie is in Bulgaria right now. And so we switched. Kyle, we were going to do this last week. We moved it this week. And then Georgie and Emma are going to join me next week. All super chats are donated to Mr. Raymond Pete. And hopefully he's been enjoying the super chat money. And yeah, we're just going to talk about all things mitochondrial respiration. I was afraid we were going to have enough things to talk about, but I actually think we have an abundance of things. So we have videos from prominent keto and carnivore people talking about metabolism. We have questions from YouTube and Patreon. But I'm just interested in the flow of the conversation. But I don't know, like maybe because I don't think everybody that's listened to this is going to know your background. So you maybe go into that just a little bit.
Okay. I don't want to say the exact same thing as last time.
It's okay. You can.
Well, Ray always says a different thing. Like instead of just saying, oh, I did this and this, he'll say, well, I got interested in estrogen because one of my classmates became psychotic when she got an estrogen injection. And her mother also became psychotic, also from an estrogen injection.
Multiple people have told me they've been impressed with how he can switch gears on that exact same question every single time.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way I think he does, which is it feels slightly disingenuous to have the same, almost like a stand-up routine that you just repeat every time somebody asks a question. It feels like you're almost plagiarizing yourself or being lazy. Yeah, so my background is, I did a biomedical PhD in the nutritional science department of Rutgers, mostly on polyunsaturated fatty acids and hypothalamic inflammation. And now I'm doing biochemistry that isn't really all that related to human health or anything like that. It's more like the more basic enzymology type stuff.
And then coupled with that, your diet history is similar to mine, but goes back even further. And that's what makes us brothers, since we've done so many different diets. But I mean, do you want to go into that a little bit? Because we are going to say some things about keto and carnivore, and I think usually people are dogging on those things, not having done them. And so at least we can say, hey, we gave years of our lives to these things. We were both proponents of, like, huge proponents. Like, I had a website about carnivore diets, and at some point felt like either the information wasn't correct or it wasn't serving us or what have you, and changed,
Yeah, I did a mostly carnivore diet. It was actually my low carb. I rolled up into one thing, like paleo, low carb, and I basically did like a raw paleo, mostly raw meat diet from about 2008. Some point in 2008, I had been transitioning from actually a mostly fruitarian, on again, off again, like different types of vegan and raw vegan diets. And then I discovered paleo, but I discovered it through the raw food community. So I discovered like raw paleo, and I also discovered the Agenus von der Planets, raw meat and raw dairy and raw like everything. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really go into a regular paleo thing. I went into like a raw paleo thing. And I think I always consumed a little bit of raw milk, even in my most carnivorous time period, but for a while, for at least a couple years, from like, sometime, I was started doing it in 2008, and then got more heavy on the meat. And for at least 2 or 3 years, I was doing, I don't know, at least like 80% of my calories were raw meat and fat. I was trying to do like a Lex Rooker style, mixing suet, raw suet, just in a food processor with leaner meat, and just, making like a ground meat kind of substitute.
But by the way, the carnivore seems to be totally oblivious to his existence, which, I mean, he's not very vocal or anything, but that is, they would have another person to point to that's been doing it for a very long time if they knew about him, because he easily predates Charles Washington and co. And so it's strange, I think, but I'm sure he's just building clocks and things.
Yeah, he doesn't really seem too interested in that kind of, like, in the marketing aspect of it, and that's really how those people like get recognized. But yeah, so I did that for a few years. I spent a very short stints in, I guess, zero carb, because that really was more of a challenge. And then I started adding carbs back in around like late 2012 and into 2013. And that's when I started getting into Ray Peat. And that was the first or second year of my PhD. And a lot of the like scientific claims of low carb, keto, and all that, I had an opportunity to read all this scientific literature, and it wasn't really adding up. They take they have their own journals, or they have their own scientists. And when you get like a broader, just regular basic nutrition education, which I'm sure, is full of normal crappy information, but just kind of getting the basics of metabolism and having to sit through these boring classes where you go through all this stuff, it changes your perspective. And I was able to kind of be open to a new thing.
Well, you've even had interesting experiences, because with the, I don't want you to have to throw anybody under the bus or anything, but the Ancestral Health Symposium. So like at what point did you start running counter to their version of the Paleolithic narrative? And then you were up against a little bit of a resistance of talking about certain things, right?
Yeah. So I went in 2011 to the first one as just a whatever it's called, audience member. And then in 2013 in Atlanta, I went and presented what was basically my PhD proposal, like what I was going to do and what I'd already done a little bit, which was mostly about comparing saturated fat and PUFA. And people liked that. It was like super technical. There's no record of it. They lost the video. But that was fine. And then I didn't really enjoy it, though. I got weird social vibes from that place. And
well, how so?
Like there was supposed to be this there was this dinner for all the presenters at, I think it was like Loren Cordain's house. I think he has a house right outside of Atlanta, or like one of those people. And you were supposed to get the information from, everybody had like a liaison in the organization, every presenter. And mine just didn't give me the information. And I remember I got I had a paranoid weekend because I didn't know anybody. And I was sitting in a hotel room alone, like kind of being nervous because this was the first time I was giving a talk in front of like 100 people, maybe a little bit more. And, feeling nervous about that. And then being on my computer and checking my email for the location and time of this dinner, and it's just not coming. And like, wondering, like, do people not like me, or like, what's the deal? And I didn't find out until years later that the guy just, like, for no reason, just forgot to send it to me. I don't know if he forgot to send it to other people or it was just me or what. So it was just like a weird vibe. And I tried to talk to some people, and the only person that was really personable that had any kind of, like, that was giving a talk was Stefan Guillenet. He was cool.
Well, you were at the dinner after the first year, right? Weren't we sitting close to each other? Or am I crazy? Denise
I don't
Winger and Guiane and Master John, I think were all there, but they were at
I
the
don't
end.
I don't think I was
No,
there.
okay. I went to some
I
dinner, but they had like segregated the table of people that were like popular bloggers and people who were
right.
nobodies, and I was at the nobody end of the table. But
Yeah.
yeah.
But then in 2016, I decided, because I had just gone full like low carb is not the way to go, or not even that it's not the way to go, but just that the science that says, it's good to burn fat and it's bad to burn carbohydrates, that's not really valid, like, and the way they're interpreting it. So I made a talk about that, and that was actually received kind of well. Like, obviously it was controversial. And then I did like the same thing the next year, and everybody was kind of like, the novelty had worn off, and they were just like, I don't know. It was fine though. It was an okay experience.
Well,
But
the first one was the fat, the hypothalamus inflammation, and then the most inflammatory one was probably the why you don't want to be a fat burner, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Was
yeah.
that the year that you felt not the most not welcomed?
Uh, no, I mean, I felt okay.
Okay.
That year actually, I think it was like a novelty. I think that, the whole thing's been dying. Like, there's less interest, and I think that I was like, I don't know, people didn't know me because I don't really have much of a presence online, and I was using technical language, which impresses people. So I think some people were excited about like just a new idea. And even though they didn't really like the idea, it was just kind of exciting. Like, people were trying to talk to me at the little get-togethers and stuff. And then the next year in 2017, it was in Seattle, and that was just kind of awful. It was like, it's a dreary place, and
What presentation was that?
that was the sugar doesn't cause insulin resistance.
Okay. Yeah. That was like a fairly technical presentation. I felt like. Yeah.
Yeah, I really put it all into that one.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know if people liked it or not, because I think my talk was on the last day, or it was kind of towards the end, and not a lot of people. There was something about that building, the university building that we had for that one, that didn't facilitate talking.
Mold damage.
Yeah, yeah. There was also all this like communist art on the wall. Like, who's that Mexican guy?
Zikaris?
No, the guy in the movie Cradle Will Rock, and he had that the wife that Salma Hayek played.
Oh, Antonio Banderas?
No, the artist, like from like the 50s.
Oh, Dolly?
He's Mexican, and he was fat, and he was a communist, and he had a wife that was played by Salma Hayek in a movie, Frida Kahlo.
Frida.
And her husband Diego something.
Okay.
Whatever. There were like murals like that, like Art Deco. It was like an exhibit, and it just weirded me out.
I was way off.
Okay. So, I think that's enough of that.
Okay, so I was getting to what we're going to talk about, mitochondrial metabolism. I was going to get to your kind of thinking that is important. And hang on, I never want to speak for you, and we have a clip that we're going to play later about Dominic D'Agostino talking about how he thinks the mitochondria call the shots. They're the most important thing we could be pretty much talking about, and what fuel you use, whether you're using free fatty acids and ketones versus starch versus sugar, those all have a different effect on the mitochondria. And so it might be good just to ask or talk about the really basic questions before we get into more technical stuff. But like, what are mitochondria, like, from your work and point of view?
Wow, big question. You mean like the theory, like materially or evolutionarily?
Just like organelles of the cell, like somebody who maybe hears that word a lot, but they don't have any point of reference for like it's in the cell and
the powerhouse of the cell.
Yeah, the powerhouse of the cell.
Yeah. So, well, theoretically, they were, the product of like a symbiotic relationship where one microbe took up another one.
How cemented is that? Is that something that like I don't
Well,
have
the problem is they can't demonstrate it. It's really hard to find evidence. The main evidence is theoretical, and that it has the two membranes.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like if it had a membrane and then it was taken up by another bigger cell, and then that cell surrounded it with a membrane.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it has two, whereas most organelles would just have one.
Again, I don't have an opinion about this, but wouldn't that be more of like within the idea that, oh, it's just an accident that it developed, and in opposing the idea that it was these increasingly bigger cycles of energy necessitating new structures or something like that?
Yeah, I'm not really sure I see a total dichotomy there where it's just like, if there's more energy around, then it's going to, whether it's like intentional or random, it's going to drive towards more complex structures.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it also has its own DNA that's complex in a totally different way than our chromosomal DNA. So that's pretty strong evidence that it's, some kind of weird thing on like normal, it's like a little bit of a cell inside of our cells.
Okay, and then the thing we'll probably be talking a lot about is like glycolysis versus mitochondrial metabolism, but maybe we should just get into that,
Yeah, or glycolysis. Okay. I mean, glycolysis in the Ray Peat term, as in not the step before.
Yeah, and I know it's a little bit confusing. Like, well, I don't know. Would you prefer fermentation? So I'm gonna just let me change my screen, just so we have some terms up. I'm gonna open up the mitochondria. I don't know. Do you want to talk about the difference of how Ray uses them versus how you probably learned in school how to use them, or how most physiology books even talk about it?
Yeah. Ray uses it as like to just talk about splitting glucose into 2 units where you get a little bit of energy. I think like 3 ATP or something, and or 4, something like that. And then that pyruvate that gets made can get turned into lactate and sent out. Like if it's made in a muscle cell or something, it can get sent out and picked up by the liver and turned back into glucose. So that's what he's mostly talking about. It's like a recycling of the same carbon units, whereas most people would learn it as the first step in oxidation of glucose.
Yeah. Yeah, so Ray talks about it being half that step. But again, I think his general point is that, and I'm getting ahead of ourselves here, but if you don't know how much of that link reaction is happening if the mitochondria aren't putting out the carbon dioxide.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I have on screen, Chris Masterjohn has a great masterclass with Masterjohn, though I stole this graphic from. But this is our little cheat sheet for glycolysis and mitochondrial metabolism and the TCA cycle and the decarboxylation of pyruvate. So I don't know where you want to start with that, but.
Okay. So yeah, I guess the only relevant points with the whole glycolysis thing is that, is the Randall cycle thing, right? As far as like glucose versus fatty acids. Yeah.
So I guess, the idea that the fatty acids are blocking the use of glucose, and that's like an acute thing that happens, correct?
Yeah. It's the while these, pathways are happening, like if you look at the cartoon and it'll show, say in the TCA cycle or something like that, it'll show all of these products and it's in a big circle. And they go from, thing to thing to thing, and then it goes back to acetyl-CoA. A lot of those products in the middle in the cycle will spit off at different areas, or if you have like extra, they can come in from outside and get thrown into that cycle. So in that way, glycolysis and beta oxidation, which are the two first steps to get glucose and fatty acids respectively ready for the TCA cycle, the products of those can go off into other things, and the products of the TCA cycle can go into other things. So one of the products of beta oxidation of fatty acids is malonyl-CoA, and that specifically inhibits the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex enzyme.
Do you want to talk about that? I feel like that's a simple concept that, again, is associated with the Randall cycle, and that pyruvate dehydrogenase is like a target, I guess, for cancer, and it does point towards the bioenergetic model. And I think it's even inhibited in diabetes and things. And that's why, like, people often say, like, oh, diabetics can't use sugar, oh, the metabolism is broken, therefore they should restrict it. But in actuality, I know there's a handful of papers that talk about how diabetics have high lactic acid levels. So it shows that sugar is getting into the cell. It's just being diverted, presumably because the pyruvate dehydrogenase is being blocked or whatever. But I feel like that is and even if you go to the Wikipedia for pyruvate dehydrogenase, it talks about the Randall cycle blocking it. Not that Wikipedia is a great resource or anything, but it's pretty standard information.
Yeah, that's all standard. The only thing that's not standard is the conclusion that if you have a problem with carbohydrate metabolism, that the problem could be from this, like, established physiological mechanism, and that you shouldn't just cut out carbohydrates. For some reason, that's just like, it's not, that's never a conclusion. I guess it's more difficult for a lot of people and the medical industry in general to take like every time you have to step backwards. It's kind of like, how they have the TSH test, and they want to give you that for thyroid, and they don't want to give you the full thyroid panel. And then if you have all of the symptoms of hypothyroid and then you have low TSH, it's very difficult to get a doctor to consider the possibility that you could have low active thyroid hormone and still have low, not high TSH, because that's just a more abstract concept. And they have to think about the whole, like, hypothalamic to pituitary, that thing that they probably actually haven't thought about since endocrinology class of medical school. So it's the same kind of thing. Like, it's a lot easier for most people to just look at the molecule that's being measured, and it's like, oh, there's a problem with this, or there's not a problem with this. And that's kind of the end of the story. Whereas obviously if there's something else driving it, it could be just as valid of a pathology or anything like that.
And I think we both agreed, like, going from a standard American diet to a low carb or keto or carnivore, like, it's very likely the food and the quality is going to increase. You might be avoiding different irritants. You start avoiding starch or hard to digest things, so that could improve your digestive health. There's many different ways you could frame those diets as, I think, being beneficial. But what, in your opinion, when you're swapping the carbohydrate for fat, and as Chris Masterjohn says right here, the carbohydrates oxidation consumes 50% less water and generates 50% more carbon dioxide than the oxidation of fat. Would that be a worthy trade-off? Like, do you think that'd still be problematic if somebody's dropping their carbohydrate and they're, based on your work on the respiratory quotient, you're producing proportionally less carbon dioxide? Mm-hmm. Do you think that would be a possibility that would be harmful in the long run?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that depends on your perspective, because most like pulmonary people, there's papers where pulmonologists or pulmonary critical care people for like, say, COPD patients, mm-hmm. they'll actually talk about like a study, or, oh, I'm going to give my patients a low carb diet to lower their CO2, because CO2 is considered like this bad thing that you have to get rid of. And in these people that have like extremely restricted airways and they can't get oxygen in, their carbon dioxide pressure will get, too high. And that's pretty much the only way people think about it, is that they think about oxygen as necessary and CO2 as unnecessary, maybe dangerous. And then people that are aware that you need CO2 to actually deliver oxygen, they'll consider it conditionally necessary.
Well, I was going to say, do you want to touch on that? Like, Gray has a great quote, and it said, because glucose can be produced from the body's structures in stress, really oxygen is the cells are bracketed by their use of oxygen to produce generate energy. And then carbon, my understanding is that carbon dioxide is bracketing the use of oxygen, but people do try to downplay that. It's like, and I get you're more of a stickler for the details. Like, do you think this gradient of carbon dioxide, based on your understanding of these long-lived areas and altitude and things, would it be reasonable to focus on carbon dioxide as something of this unknown factor almost in health that barely anybody is talking about?
Yeah. I mean,
pretty loaded question.
Yeah, it's one of those problems where there's a lot of acute, like it's easy to find acute evidence that if you don't have CO2, like if you're hyperventilating in an acute way, then you'll have a problem because your hemoglobin can't carry and deliver oxygen to the cells. And that'll be expressed in usually like if somebody doesn't treat hyperventilation, they'll have like a seizure or something because their brain won't get oxygen for too long. But other than that, it's very hard to, you'd have to look at somebody's whole life and there's other factors. So yeah, it does seem like there's a lot of those, what are they called? Like clusters of people that live for a long time.
The blue groups, the blue zone groups?
Zones.
Yeah,
zones. Yeah, there's a lot of those that are high altitude. So it's more like a theoretical thing than anything that has like good experimental evidence.
Well, to trend on the theoretical thing, your work on the removal of intracellular calcium, I mean, that just a basic thing about cells is you don't want to overload them with calcium. And so when carbon dioxide, I mean, it from my totally minimal understanding, seems like something, if it were too low, would be real devastating to all the processes in the body, right?
Yeah. Well, so carbon dioxide, so when it gets made, it gets kicked out of the cells as dissolved gas, and then some of it will complex with water in bicarbonate, and some of it will complex with calcium. So there's just this constant stream, and the more CO2 you're producing, the more you're moving those things out. And for calcium in particular, the faster you can get calcium out of the cell or into some kind of sequestered situation after it's released, the better.
Well, do you have an opinion on like when the stress systems start like kicking in? Like, wouldn't hypoxia or a lack of carbon dioxide either or activate the stress systems? Do you think?
Yeah. Well, it would turn up liver enzymes for. All the cells would start doing more lactic acid production because they're not able to, because there's these bottlenecks, and one of them is ultimately using oxygen to be able to pull either glycolytic, glucose equivalent or fatty acid equivalent substrate through the entire oxidative pathway. And if you cut off oxygen at the end of that and, further upstream, or outside of the cell, CO2 to deliver the oxygen, then you're going to block that whole thing up.
I didn't know that a lot of papers do talk about it, but that's like the pseudo hypoxia condition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is like on a micro level, the Warburg effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, pseudo hypoxia would be, I think, pseudo-hypoxia would be used to describe anything that causes oxygen to not get to the cells, even though there's oxygen. But yeah, like CO2, hyperventilation would technically be pseudo-hypoxia.
Yeah. And so like I mean, it's not impossible to believe people with low thyroid function are essentially hyperventilating 24/7. And then like I used to have pretty bad sleep apnea. And so I'd go to sleep and then I'd wake up and it would like look like I was dead in the morning. I would look so hypoxic. From my neck up would be white. And so that was kind of like a experience of hypoxia in real time almost.
That sounds pretty bad.
I have some pictures. Okay, so I mean, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Do you identify with the Hans Selye kind of idea of stress and accumulation and things, or do you have a more nuanced view of it?
Yeah, I do, and I think it makes sense that an organism like a human would have these systems that are there for emergencies, like something like blood clotting, which is usually a problem, right? It's like, oh, I have a blood clot that could kill me. But in nature, if you lost a finger or whatever, like, and there's no medical, so obviously like all of these systems that cause problems, it makes sense that they'd be there for an emergency. And the cortical, the whole like adrenal gland system seems to be that for not having enough of whatever it is in your blood metabolically, and that it would get that it's a trade-off where it's not this perfect system where it's, oh, we don't have this, so we'll turn on this other system and there's no negative consequences. Because that wouldn't make sense, because if there were two equivalent systems, there'd be no reason not to use the other one. Do you know what I mean?
A little bit. Explain more.
It's kind of like if you had a backup generator and that worked just as efficiently as your generator. You know what I mean? Like usually, or like say you have a spare tire. Like everybody's spare tire is a crappier tire than the real tires, right? They're like usually like little, like they call them dinghies, I think, right? Yeah. They're like little, or some people have real, if you have a bigger vehicle, you can have a real extra tire. But the point is, if you had a good tire that was your spare tire, you'd put it on for using all the time and then have something crappy for the emergency when you just have to drive 10 miles to get somewhere to get new tires when you know what I mean? So that's what I think of as the stress system, is like normally your body runs with a normal metabolism, with a normal amount of salt coming in and like sugars and everything else. And that's great. And then when you get cut off from that, you have this other system that can kick in to keep you alive. But obviously it's not as good, because why would it be as good? Why would it be as safe as the main system?
I love that. So I have this graphic up that I think I sent you, but it talks about how multiple forms of energy substrate turn it, like waterfall, petroleum, coal, nuclear fission. I hope I'm saying that right. Like to lamp, air conditioning, loudspeaker, automobile. And Hans Selye, who figured out a lot of the details of stress, he had a graphic where it was like marital disagreement, frustration by boss, combat fatigue, burns, all going through the black box of stress and then resulting in different health outcomes. And so he says non-specificity, each result on the left is specific, each causative agent on the right is specific, yet they are all non-specific results in that they must go through a common pathway. No direct connection is possible between a result and a cause. And that made sense to me, because again, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is more of like a connecting everything together of how all these diseases and problems are related to this concept of bioenergetics and mitochondrial metabolism and things like that. And then if you add on top of that I don't know about you, but I grew up eating Cinnamon Toast Crunch and Fruity Pebbles and things. And so like my polyunsaturated fatty acid consumption growing up was probably just out of control. And so when you're super saturated with the polyunsaturated fats, and then you're kind of choosing how best to support your not activating those systems that you just talked about, the low carb and keto and the carnivore stuff, although as we mentioned, I'm totally under the impression that can have some benefits, seems a little risky.
Right. I'm sorry, was there
wasn't really a question. I was just basically monologuing.
Yeah, that's cool.
I just want to read one other thing, but this is the Walter Cannon quote. And he says, the extraordinary unstable stuff of which our bodies are constituted is persistently subjected to various external and internal conditions, which if not resisted would profoundly alter its ability to function. And I really love that because it does. It's like, it's talking about our fragility as humans. And again, I'm on a tirade right now, but like, I think that's what is kind of missing from the low carb and the keto and the carnivore people, is like the nuance to what's actually going on in the body. I don't know. Maybe this would be a good time to jump into those videos. Or you read the paper by the high intensity health gentleman. We could talk about that.
Oh, I didn't read the whole thing. I mean, I looked at it and I got the gist. That's not going to take long to talk about because there's really nothing. It's not. I mean, it's based. There's like if you make a mistake right away, then you can only really talk. It's like if there's a 10-step process and you make a mistake at step 1, it's really hard to discuss all 10 steps because you're basically just like, you're not working with anything relevant. So I think that's just it's a weird study. I could see why somebody would jump on it because it says something that sounds good to low carb people, but
just to back up a little bit. So the high intensity health dude, somebody sent this to me. That's why I was aware of it, but he made a video about, people, because it's like people say this other than myself and you, but like fasting and ketosis are stressful to the body. But this paper allegedly found that carbohydrates amplify the cortisol, the response to stress, amplify cortisol in response to stress. And when I was reading through it, I thought it was like kind of represented how they don't have like I know I'm speaking very broadly here, but just in general that I didn't think they had like a functioning system of stress, because as we'll get to the videos of Paul Saladino and Dominic D'Agostino, like they'll say like things very specifically about like, I've never seen keto or carnivore cause a stress response in a patient of mine. And it's like, how could you make that such a huge claim? Like, are you measuring their prolactin, their growth hormone, their pulse and their temperature and stuff? So again, kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how if you just have like a quantized small view of everything, maybe you can say things like that. But once you pull back and you consider the endocrinology, the saturation of the polyunsaturated fats and all those different factors, it seems really hard to make broad sweeping statements like that.
Right. So yeah, well, they're taking, like in this example, cortisol in response to a stress test, the amount that it goes up as indicative of what. It's just really weird because they did a short term, like nobody that's saying a low carb diet or fasting is stressful is saying that eating a piece of meat causes stress, and that's like what they were studying. They were like, okay, so so they're taking people that I'm assuming, because none of those people, they were normal people on normal diets, right? It wasn't people on.
To my understanding, that's what happened. Yeah.
Right. So they took random people that were normal, healthy people and had some of them eat a low carbohydrate meal and then gave them a stress test that was like kind of emotional in nature. They had to do math in front of people publicly.
So. Yeah.
So it's like a combination of like math anxiety and public speaking anxiety. And then they gave another group of people water, and then they gave another group of people something with carbohydrate in it. And the water groups and the low carb groups had a lower cortisol response to the stress test than the carbohydrate group.
And it was taken in their saliva too, which I think is probably important.
Yeah, so I don't see that that's really like acute cortisol release is not what people are talking about when they're talking about fasting or low carb being bad. In fact, they're specifically talking about something chronic. Because a fast cortisol response is what the stress system is for. Like it's literally for like, oh shit, a lion, like run away, and then you get away, hopefully, and then the cortisol goes down and you're done. And the higher you could spike that cortisol to get like more gluconeogenic substrate in your blood and all of that as possible, that's great. Like a strong acute cortisol response is good, and to have it resolved is good. It's the same thing as inflammation. Like if you have damage to a tissue, it's not really a sign of health if you can't produce inflammatory proteins.
Well, that's why cortisol is kind of good, because it makes glucose, right? And that's anti-inflammatory. Yeah.
Right. But at the cost of using like protein, whether it's like dietary amino acids or in the absence of them, like muscle or other lean tissues in the body. So yeah, it's just, I don't know. That's just a really weird experiment. I guess I don't know that some of these people like the Dominic D'Agostino, he has a lab, and
well, do you want to play those videos? Okay, so hopefully this
sure.
Hopefully this works. I was freaking out before this because it didn't work. Okay. Okay, so should we? Okay, this is Paul. Again, I just want to clarify. I really do like both of these people. Like, I'm not playing this to dump on Paul or Dom. Like I'm doing this to hopefully only for myself and for anybody watching to hopefully gain clarity on the different school of thought, you know. And so I don't want people to hopefully think that this is some YouTube beef or something, because you do have to say that, unfortunately. But I do really like both of these people, and I have sped up these clips slightly just to get through them as quickly as possible. So this is the first clip. Okay, so if I remember right, Paul asks Dominic what happens when a person drops their carbohydrate. Okay, hopefully this works.
Right.
And it didn't work. That sucks. Okay, I'm screwed, guys. I thought this was gonna work. Anyways, well, I guess we can't necessarily talk about those, but Dom does say, I mean, this is just kind of rehashing what we were talking about. Sorry, guys, I had all these video clips loaded up to play, and then I don't know why they're not working. Kyle, do you want to just say some things, and I'll try to load them up real fast?
Yeah, I'll fill in for this boomer tech here.
Yeah, I have strong boomer tech tendencies.
Well, I remember the one video he was saying, he basically, because these people, which are fine people, they focus on insulin so much that I don't think that they can really discuss anything having to do with carbohydrate without making it like insulin centric. So I remember, they said when you drop your carbohydrates, your glucose will go down, and then your glycogen will go up, insulin will go down, and your liver will start to liberate.
You know what changes happen in the metabolism
You got it?
with fasting or with a zero or very low carb
Can you
diet?
guys hear that?
Shift into making ketones and using ketones.
Kyle, I don't think you can hear it though.
I like to simplify it as much as possible, but
that's fine.
The first thing that typically
maybe
happens
I
is
maybe I can kind of like
you just stop eating or eliminate all carbohydrates. So you will actually have a drop in your blood glucose. And if you're eating a ketogenic diet where you've moderated the protein,
what happens if someone doesn't eat
Can you hear
carbohydrates?
this
Like what
now?
changes happen in their metabolism with fasting or with a zero or very low carbohydrate diet? How does our body shift?
Yeah, I just turned it on.
Making ketones from using ketones.
That's a good question. So I like to simplify it as much as possible, but the first thing that typically happens is that you have a drop in your blood glucose level if you just stop eating or eliminate all carbohydrates. So you will actually have a drop in your blood glucose. And if you're eating a ketogenic diet where you've moderated the protein, you'll significantly reduce the postprandial elevations or excursions in your blood glucose and also the corresponding elevation of insulin, which will facilitate glucose transport and glycolytic pathways, right? So fasting or carbohydrate restriction in the context of the ketogenic diet, you have a prolonged suppression of the hormone insulin and a corresponding increase in elevation of glucagon. And in the beginning, a lot of people can experience an elevation of stress hormones like catecholamines, epinephrine, and cortisol can also go up, especially initially. And these things will it's the body's way to help liberate some of the stored glycogen that you have through glycogenolysis. So you'll start to release some glucose in the liver. And then once the liver glycogen is depleted, the liver is really the energetic sensor of the body and coordinates very well with the brain. And liver glycogen is kind of like a fuel tank, and your brain can sense that, and you start to get some neuroendocrine changes in addition to facilitating the suppression of the hormone insulin, and elevated catecholamines will liberate fatty acids from adipose tissue, and those fatty acids will be mobilized. They get to the liver. That stimulates beta oxidation of the fatty acids, and as you have greatly accelerated fat oxidation in the liver, essentially you'll be you have beta hydroxybutyrate going to acetoacetate, and that splits to two acetyl-CoA molecules, and we're not even that. So the beta oxidation of fatty acids will make acetyl-CoA, and that'll condense to acetoacetate and ultimately beta hydroxybutyrate. So that would be ketogenesis. So that happens, and then ketolysis is the other way around.
Okay, so like to me, everything he said sounded bad. And especially the liver as like, how did he call it? Like a homeostatic mechanism for the whole organism. Like
energy sensing, did he say?
He said a specific phrasing. But like the reason why I caught that is because he described it so similarly to how Ray describes it. But again, I know it's like a framing thing that he would just frame those things at least possibly after an acute stress response, which he basically said would be good. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the only difference is that he was emphasizing, you could kind of tell that when somebody's explaining something like that, he was talking about insulin going down like it's a good thing. And then he sort of glossed over like, oh, well, there's a temporary, increase in catecholamines, which, by the way, cortisol is not a catecholamine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are. Cortisol is a steroid. But anyway, and then I've heard people say this a lot. This is kind of on the same level as sugar causes insulin resistance, where people just say it and there's never any kind of like grand, like seminal work or defining work that proves it or anything. It's just kind of something people say. But they say, oh, once you're keto adapted, your cortisol stops being high. And first of all, I'm not sure, that there's been a whole lot of work done on that. I'm sure that,
or any work done on that.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if it went down a little bit. But what's funny is people say that without any kind of so there's these people saying, oh, your cortisol will go up initially because your body will be trying to make glucose from protein, and then it'll learn how to use fatty acids, with making ketones, and then it'll stop doing that over time, or do that at a low level. It's fine. And then there's all of these people who do low carb or whatever variant complaining about adrenal fatigue. And it's like, so they're talking about your adrenal gland getting worked really hard at the beginning of this diet. And then they're like, oh, but don't worry, like the output of that gland will go down over time. It'll lower. And then there's all these people complaining of adrenal fatigue, that their adrenals, the output is like, sub-normal. And nobody's like seems to be putting that together as like maybe the zero carbohydrate or whatever they're doing, really low carb, that causes, the necessity of cortisol and epinephrine to liberate these substrates. If you do that long enough, eventually your adrenal gland will lose the ability to, respond the way that it used to when it wasn't being used chronically to just do normal metabolic functions, and that those are related. And that's not just some weird coincidence that there's all these people with adrenal fatigue.
Well, I don't want to. I had never heard Dom or Paul say that, so I wouldn't want to. I think you're right. I think people do say that they say it exactly like you just described it. But I think, and I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I did hear Paul or maybe it was the high intensity health dude say that it's the blood sugar swings that causes the cortisol response. And I had heard that many, many, many times in the zeroing in on health stuff, because I was aware of how bad cortisol was to have a prolonged excess of. And I always thought to myself, well, yeah, they're probably right. It's just the blood sugar swings, and that causes the excess of cortisol. But I think they forget about the liver and its ability to store glucose in between meals, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, didn't Dominic say that you'll go through a period of high, what he called epinephrine output, and then that will go down over time? Didn't he just say that
in that clip?
Video?
Yeah. Maybe I couldn't tell you. I'd have to listen to it again.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Don't play it again.
Well, we have 2 more clips to get through, so my boomer tech will still have to get through them. Should I play so that was the first part of what I found interesting. And then Paul kind of wants to clarify what Dom just said, because my interpretation of it was like, he just said that low carb stresses you out. And I think these people are fighting against that idea. So I don't think he wants that notion to be out there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just throw this other video, and then we can talk about it.
There's so much discussion, or I think there's misinformation in the community that when you go into ketosis, you're going to activate your stress hormones. And like you suggested, I think that when people acutely adapt, there is some evidence for that. But my impression is it doesn't happen long term. Those are normalized. Is that correct? Because people often knock the ketogenic diet and say, oh, you're activating your sympathetic nervous system, you're activating cortisol. And it's not what I see clinically once you get to be keto adapted. So how does that, if we pull that timeline out a little further, what does it look like if you stay in ketosis for weeks or months? And how does our body begin to adapt to that?
Yeah, I think the patient population, or the people to look at in regards to this, are people who
have been sorry, guys. I guess it's too, the clips are too fast, but it's just the way it is.
There's so much discussion, or I think there's misinformation in the community that...
By the way, can you hear it, Kyle?
There's so much discussion, or I think there's misinformation in the community that when you go into ketosis, you're going to activate your stress hormones. And like you suggested, I think that when people acutely adapt, there is some evidence for that. But my impression is it doesn't happen long term, and those eventually normalize. Is that correct? Because people will often knock the ketogenic diet and say, oh, you're activating your sympathetic nervous system, you're activating cortisol. And it's not what I see clinically once you get to be keto adapted. So how does that, if we pull that timeline out a little further, what does it look like if you stay in ketosis for weeks or months? And how does our body begin to adapt to that?
Yeah, I think the patient population, or the people to look at in regards to this, are people who have been following the ketogenic diet for decades, right? And I met some of them. I was in Washington, D.C. at a neurometabolic sort of disease conference where I had the opportunity to meet with people, many people who've been doing this for many years. And they have, their blood work looks fantastic, actually. And they're on like a pretty legitimate high ratio ketogenic diet that's in upwards of anywhere from 75 to 90% fat. Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you have an opinion about? To be honest, I haven't seen any like specific long-term low-carb stuff of measurements of prolactin and things that I would consider part of the stress response. But the one thing I would hang my hat on is there are papers, and I put them in some of my videos. And again, Chris Masterjohn's whole basic physiology of the production of carbon dioxide, that you will produce less carbon dioxide on a ketogenic style diet. And we were kind of talking earlier about that just being stressful, promoting a gradient of hypoxia. But again, the one last thing I want to comment on is it kind of, Chris Kresser used to do this when I would talk to him. When he necessarily wouldn't have like some kind of like you said, some seminal paper or something, he would say, well, my clinical experience, like that doesn't happen. And I'm sorry, but like, I think Paul has been a carnivore for a year. Like how many carnivorous patients has he had in that time? And then what is he measuring to deduce that they are not stressed? How could he say that so confidently? It seems like it's like totally baffling to me how somebody could say that.
Yeah. I mean, I would assume that if he had patients, and this is just like a random observation, but if he's putting somebody on a carnivore diet, they're probably somebody with like a metabolic problem. Mm-hmm. So they probably already have elevated cortisol. So I wouldn't be surprised if average like overweight American person is going to this guy, and then this guy puts him on a carnivore diet, and he, loses weight and stuff like that. And he has the same cortisol as he had when he was presenting with like a normal kind of type 2 diabetic thing.
You're right.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, a year isn't a long time. And I mean, it would be nice if people were trying to make it has that sound of like brushing something under the rug. Like, oh, in my experience, like his experience should include recorded numbers. Because you do that, you know, like if I said, oh, in my experience, when I was doing research, it seemed like this happened. If I did that, like say if I was like defending my dissertation or if I was writing a paper, like it's just a joke. Like people wouldn't even, they would look at you and wonder like why you're even employed in this field.
Well, again, and like the one other thing I'll say, and I didn't actually collect the clips because I was getting out of control with how many clips I was collecting, but Paul and multiple low carb or ketogenic or carnivore advocates say like, yeah, your cholesterol, your LDL, your total cholesterol is going to go up when you eat this way. And again, this is kind of like the carbon dioxide thing. This is to me a somewhat indicator of your thyroid function. And so when your cholesterol is rising, that means like it has an inverse relationship with your thyroid. And again, they're not seeing it like that. So when they don't have a model of how, like there's that paper of students that they're having a final test and their cholesterol goes up until they take the test and then their cholesterol goes down after the test. So again, just like this, the adaptive qualities of cholesterol to presumably produce pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, et cetera. Like when they're not building that into their model, yeah, of course, nothing is stressful, nothing is thyroid suppressive. When they're saying like, oh yeah, I think it's going to go up, but it's just not, nothing's connected with each other. So I guess it doesn't register.
Yeah, they're definitely coming at it from this is a good thing. So how can we talk about the results of this thing in a positive way? Like they're not coming at it from a neutral or critical perspective. They're coming at it from like it's like news spin, you know, like, oh, we've got high cortisol. How can we make that good? Like, okay, it looks like it went down a little bit. I guess that's good. But it wasn't bad before when it was higher. Whatever it is, it's good. And we can explain why.
Well, I'm just going to play this last clip of Dom just for posterity. You know, it's like 2 seconds. But he does
really
talk about the mitochondria and probably to get us back on topic.
The health of any human or cell or tissue or whatever. So it really does come back down. I don't want to sound biased, but metabolism is, and the food that we eat is essentially our metabolism, is really the root.
Bear with me with my boomer tech.
Health, like the mitochondria kind of call the shots, and you could say that for neurological diseases, overall health, and even cancer too.
There we go. Okay.
So really preserving mitochondrial ATP production is the most important thing for the health of any human or cell or tissue or whatever. So it really does come back down. I don't want to sound biased, but metabolism is, and the food that we eat is essentially our metabolism, is really the root of general health. Like the mitochondria kind of call the shots, and you could say that for neurological diseases, overall health, and even cancer too.
So, and again, not to beat a dead horse, but I just don't think you can talk about those things without carbon dioxide, without the endocrine stress system. But do you think that's going too far, or do you think that's a safe thing to say?
What thing? The thing he said about mitochondria?
Well, it's saying like you can't even begin to approach that subject without factoring things like carbon dioxide in the endocrine system. You know, like we were saying, they're kind of glossing over the stress component, but you can't talk about mitochondrial health and then not talk about the various endocrine factors and things.
I guess you can. I don't know. He found a way.
Well, they have found a way, but
yeah. No, high fat people, like when I first started grad school, oh God, what was his name? He was a blogger. He was pretty popular. I think he worked in England or maybe somewhere in the European continent as an anesthesiologist, and he was like a low carb, high fat blogger.
Peter, right?
Did he have like a Slavic name? what was his name?
Pietro. Yeah, hyperlipid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had like a very brief back and forth with him when I first started grad school, and I read his blog a little bit, and he would talk about going to conferences or whatever, and he was always talking about like how important the mitochondria is, and he believed in like a high fat diet. So apparently there's no perception of a contradiction there.
Well, I don't remember when. This was a long time ago, but I think he linked. Do you remember? There was like a girl blogger that didn't like me, and then she was friends with Peter, and Peter said something like, "Nobody will remember who he is. He's never going to like leave his mark anywhere, or something." And he like tagged my name in it so that I would see it. It was super bizarre.
Yeah, I don't remember that. Because I wasn't following when I got into that stuff, and I discovered like this guy, and I had already been a little burnt out on like spending time on the internet about nutrition. Mm-hmm. So like I read a decent amount of Chris Masterjohn's stuff and like a little bit of Guillenet, but as far as like getting to know all the bloggers and like the personal drama, I am extremely removed from any of that.
Well, this was personal drama that was brought to my front door. So I'm still raw about it. I'm just kidding. Should we take some callers, or do you want to go through questions, callers, or talk about that Amber paper?
Well, no, let's talk about the Amber paper, because I think that is related to what we were just talking about, and I think it's interesting.
Okay, so okay, go ahead. I have it popped up.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see here. Do you?
Now I do. It should take a second.
Oh yeah, because I'm on a delay.
Man, Hot and Sassy is really all over you, Kyle. You maybe you two should get linked up.
Yeah, I already said in the chat that I wasn't single, but that doesn't really seem to have an effect. That's okay. So yeah, this is a paper that actually, so what you have up there is, this might be, all right. So I don't think that this is like illegal.
Oh, is this a not published paper yet?
Yeah. Well, this is the pre-reviewed paper. So we're not really going to go into the paper, but just scroll.
Should I scroll down?
Yeah, just scroll to the bottom.
Here, let me just.
I don't really think she did that many edits anyway. I didn't even read the second version.
Yeah, I'll just like change.
I probably shouldn't say that.
The screen, so I'm not like. Okay.
It's fine. It's a fine paper.
Well, I did highlight a few things. Do you want to talk about the details in the paper?
Yeah, well, I can just discuss like what the paper is about and what. So I was a reviewer on it, and I guess yeah. I mean, whatever. This isn't like a big deal. So it's basically a defense of keto using mostly Arctic populations. So one of the like classic things is saying there's this group of people, like Inuit people or that live on like a mostly carnivorous diet, and for certainly part of the year, they live on mostly a carnivorous diet, and generation after generation. So the idea is that it's like possible, one, and that maybe even since humanity has like passed through colder periods, that maybe everybody has passed through, like everybody was an Inuit at some point in our genetic history or whatever. Mm-hmm. So we all have the ability to live on this diet, and maybe it's more healthy. That's one of the defenses. And so this particular paper, it talked about this study of one population, and it was putting them in ketosis. And the funny thing was, it was almost like surprising that she would think this is good for keto, because the conclusion was that, well, one, just bringing these people in, so these people that are on like a mostly carnivorous diet, they weren't in ketosis. Mm-hmm. And then they were more resistant to going into ketosis than normal people. So they would have to have a lower carbohydrate intake for longer to have measurable ketones.
And she was saying it was because of the CYP1 enzyme for beta
CPT.
Yeah, the beta oxidation.
Yeah, that's a transport protein, the carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1A. So that was their big, like, kind of genetic difference that's very clear between this population and everybody else. And the thing about that is it causes what's known as protein, or I guess gluconeogenesis tolerance or protein tolerance. So that basically they're better at making glucose out of protein than normal people. So the conclusion that I took from this paper, so the conclusion she's trying to make, I'm not even really sure. It was that there's this population and they're keto adapted, and it's great. But in reality, they're actually adapted to be more resistant to ketosis than everyone else. So they're almost like, on a genetic level, anti-keto adapted, so they can get more glucose out of protein than a normal, Asian or European or African person could do before going into ketosis. So they're almost ketosis resistant, and that is their adaptation for being on this carnivorous diet. So it's almost the exact opposite. And then the other thing I said was, if that's true, so, and she's making the argument that they're genetically more adapted to keto than we are. If that's true, then what does this even have to...
But wasn't she saying in the PUFA consumption was something that like overturned their adaptation or something?
Oh, I don't remember that part.
Because she was, the thing that I kind of thought was mildly interesting was she was saying that the PUFA were more ketogenic in a way, and they upregulated that enzyme. And so I didn't, if that's true, I didn't know that.
Yes.
I didn't mean to derail you. I thought that was just mildly interesting.
Yeah, no, I just found the part in the paper where it says that. Yeah, I had forgotten about that. So that's something that is kind of expected because PUFA require more chaperoning into the mitochondria because they're more hydrophilic than saturated fats. So they pass through, membranes and stuff less well. So that makes sense. And so, yeah, you would have to have more intentional transport of a PUFA than a similarly sized saturated fatty acid. But so there's this specialized population, and their specialty, regardless of what their specialty is, the fact that they have a genetic difference that is obvious that they all have and that we don't have kind of invalidates this as a defense of keto for everybody. Like, if you were trying to make the argument, everybody can run, like, this particular, like, Olympic race or whatever, and the only people that can actually do it are these people with, like, a special genetic mutation. And it's like, no, look, these people can do it. Like, so you can do it because humans can do it. These people are human, but like they have a special adaptation for it. That doesn't work that way. What would be powerful evidence would be if there was a population that lived on a mostly or entirely carnivorous diet that did not have notable genetic metabolic related mutations from everyone else. That would be good evidence that we could all do it.
Yeah.
This is the opposite.
Yeah. They're resisting that state, basically.
Right. Yeah. So not only do they have a mutation that helps them on this carnivorous diet that most other humans don't have, but it's a mutation that's resistant to ketosis. So at every level of the argument, it's like, it's not a crushing blow to like the keto thing, but it is not support. And it's like mild to moderate contradiction of a defense of like keto for everybody. Keto is healthy for everybody. And that was so funny. Like, I was asked to be a reviewer on that, and that was after I'd had like a falling out with what's his name?
Aaron Blaisdell.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was just a funny situation because I kind of forgot about that. And some other person, like somebody working in the journal that I was kind of like friends, like acquaintances with that I'd met a couple times, and emailed me and asked me to review these papers. And I was halfway through doing it before I realized I was reviewing papers for Givo, like for Aaron's journal, and that I didn't like him anymore. But it was a fun exercise because I got to see this, and I got to see that if this is the level of deductive ability of the concepts behind keto, like that's just a very low level. Because at the time I hadn't been really reading and writing about metabolism. I was working on enzymology, and I was able to look at that and just see like, this doesn't make any sense. This only makes sense if you contort everything from the perspective that keto, if you go into it thinking whatever the conclusion is, it's going to support that keto is healthy. That's the only way that you could reach that conclusion with this paper.
Well, you say it's like studies with respiratory quotient might be a way to get there, and you were talking about like a way to find out ketogenic adaptation, like the level of ketogenic adaptation, and like the respiratory quotient's not some rare idea, and you're right. It's like, why wouldn't you use the basic ways to make a judgment to prove your point, rather than these more roundabout ways that are more obscure, Oh,
is that the thing about when they were measuring urine ketones? And
I think so. Yeah. So you said, I don't know. In other words, in this advanced state of ketosis, an experiment with data supported is merely conjecture. Studies with respiratory quotient. I think that was it, because you were saying they were measuring urinary ketones, but they weren't measuring blood ketones, right?
Yeah, the claim was that they didn't have good data sets with blood ketones, and it's just like, what are we doing? Like, I mean, so just to be clear, the claim is that the claim is that, and this is related to what Dominic said before about how the stress hormones will go up and then they'll go down when you become keto adapted. Mm-hmm. So one of the other claims about keto adaptation is that at first you see a lot of ketones in the urine, and that's how you know you're in ketosis. Mm-hmm. But over time, your body becomes more efficient at using them, and your urine ketones go down. Now that makes sense. That's fine. But there's these studies where people just look at urine ketones and say, these people are in ketosis. But then if they don't have urine ketones, they'll say, oh, they're keto adapted. But it could just be that they came out of ketosis. Like, two things will make you stop having urine ketones, right? If they're getting used at a higher level so that they're not being excreted, or if you're not making as many anymore. Mm-hmm. So if you really want to prove that somebody's keto adapted, and they want to prove this so bad, you need to have a person that, and maybe it's true. I mean, maybe there is a state, I'm sure some of them are still excreted, but maybe there is a state that you reach where a relatively insignificant amount of urine ketones are excreted after a while. I don't think that makes it good, but it makes sense. But you would have to show that the ketones are being made, like in the blood, like take blood ketones, or you could even biopsy cells and look for ketones in there that are being metabolized. I mean, some kind of way. You can't just say, we think theoretically that after a while urine ketones go down because your body becomes more efficient at using them, and then use urine ketones going down as proof that you became keto adapted. That's just a circular reasoning. You have to have some other data point to support, like, to connect those things. And they don't have one, as far as I can tell. I mean, this was this author was writing a defense of, so I'm assuming if that data existed, she would have presented it.
Well, maybe Amber specifically interested in the Arctic people. This was this year, 2019? I was reading this.
I think it was late last year.
Again, I could be totally out of bounds on this, but I feel like studying these groups of people is just like, you say it right here. Is this useful? Is this a useful model for discussing ketosis and nutrition at all? And then you say later, it's like, instead they become kind of interesting one-off case study and exception rather than the rule that proponents of this diet would have them be. In other words, if the answer to why Arctic population ketosis is hard to measure, and there was a long confusion about it, is that they are mutants with a different metabolism than all the other human populations, it then needs to be stated that this precludes them from use as an example of how the average American et al. Can maintain a chronic healthy ketosis. It's just like it seems so just I don't know, like you said, not useful to like make huge conclusions based off these groups of people, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's useful to make like interesting metabolic discoveries about a different population that has like a different diet and like specific genetic mutations to deal with that diet. But in what way is that useful to craft the diet of other people? You know, it's like studying, you know, dog diet and then being like, well, I got my cat food. Like I got my cat diet. Like they're just not, and you know, to the extent that they're different, they're not useful for a model or a comparison or anything like that. And like that just seems like such a simple point. I don't know.
Well, maybe it's because their ideas are based completely off of speculative evolutionary arguments.
Right. And yeah, I don't think that there's been like the Inuit, you know, that early stuff of like the original Inuit research into high fat diets. And there was like scientists that lived with them and tried those diets and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Karsten and Stefansson.
Yeah. Weren't those like, they didn't really say that the health of those people was that good, right?
Actually, I can't believe I'm name dropping him, but there's a guy named like Red Pill Vegan, and he went through like
sounds really based.
He's very based. He went through some of like the original papers, and it like talked about how Stefansson was like in pretty like he wasn't somebody you'd want to model your health after, basically. Like he wasn't in good shape necessarily. But the reason why I remember his video is he's pretty funny about it, and like, and he was like, I don't know about you all, but like, I don't want to like base my entire nutrition on the idea of not dying from scurvy. like that's some like huge amazing feat of not dying from scurvy that they did, and so he made me laugh, so that's why I remembered it. But yeah, like again, like the Charlene and Joe Anderson. Like the people who used to eat only pemmican and now apparently eat ribeyes and things. Lex Rooker, Charles Washington, a handful of other people that are just kind of around. And the Stefansson, Karsten people, you'll just, if you go in the carnivore scene, you'll hear those people ad nauseum as is some like infallible proof of the benefits of that style of eating.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I derailed you. Were you going to make another point about them?
I
think they also had a really poor glucose tolerance. Like they had a glucose tolerance test, and they were like extremely insulin resistant.
Right, which is perfectly like that's great.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense to the whole analogy that we've been using for a long time about how the solution to insulin resistance for low carb people is just get rid of the need for using insulin and not addressing insulin sensitivity or anything like that.
Or the chronic damage of the beta cells. What do you want to take callers or go through questions?
Yeah, whatever's easier.
Well, let's go through a few questions and then we'll commit show suicide by doing the calls.
Okay.
Let me switch this. Do you know Jimmy Moore got his YouTube deleted?
You know what? I think I saw that in passing. There's just so many people getting social media deleted, and I don't care about him. That is I would have never thought about it again if you didn't just bring it up.
Well, that it stuck out to me because it's like that's the first time I've heard of a health person getting their YouTube deleted like that. I don't know. I think I don't necessarily trust him. I don't know if he said something like kind of maybe like that YouTube would really not like, like he had the channel Jimmy Rants. Did you ever watch any of this?
No, man.
Maybe I have too much time on my hands.
Yeah. One of the only times I listened to that guy was when you were on his thing. Was it like 2011 maybe?
11 or 10 for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. That was funny. That's when you were into leptin. Everybody was into leptin.
Yeah. I haven't listened to it for years, but I remember re-listening to it at one point and just like cringing. Like I couldn't even, I remember being like pass out nervous for it though, at the time. So I think I remember working in that leptin idea, like really close to the interview, and like I just have no idea. Still have no idea, but I didn't have any idea what I was talking about. Okay, let's just go through a few of these because we kind of have a lot. So George says, what do you guys think about a carnivore style diet with added sugar, honey, OJ, milk, and cheese? I don't know if he's joking or not, but like
that sounds pretty good. I think he might have something there.
Sounds solid. Truth Co says, can you build up the lactate threshold, otherwise known as the resiliency towards lactic acid, when resistance training? Best thing to do for this is multiple questions. Okay, that first one. Did you get that?
Yeah. I don't know. I know that's one of those things that, like in the bodybuilding or the sports performance world, how people will debate whether muscle hyperplasia is possible, like questions like that. I think that's one of those debated questions about whether your lactic acid metabolism is more genetically determined or if it's highly trainable. I really don't know.
Only thing I don't know if I've ever said it on YouTube, but in like 2013, when I moved to San Francisco, I hooked up with a personal trainer. And the thing I told him, I was like, dude, I do not want you to try to kill me every single time we have a workout. And he proceeded to try to kill me every single time we had a workout. And I'd be so sore that it'd be like 4 or 5 days of just like complete soreness. But if I took an aspirin before, I would have almost zero soreness. And I know like one of the possibilities is that it lowered lactic acid. Okay. We kind of talked about the other questions in this gentleman's thing earlier. Logan Taylor says, what advice would you have for an undergrad? What major do you think is most beneficial, least distorted, best study methods?
Well, I'm assuming that undergrad, it's to eventually do research. So from that perspective, I would say biology is bad. Chemistry is probably better if you could do like biochemistry. Mm-hmm. Things that are farther away from, as a general rule, like a big broad rule, the farther away from controversy. So like biology is bad because there's a lot of people, there's a lot of things about environmentalism, and those are very controversial. So there's a lot of distortions. Whereas something like chemistry is much more industry based. It's more just kind of cut and dry. Biochemistry is a little bit in between those two. Physiology is good. Not every place has a physiology department or a degree. I mean, every college is different, but I would say whatever is the thing within the biomedical field that is the closest to either chemistry, but with a biomedical, like a biochemistry or a molecular biology, or something with the word physiology in it. And study habits. I've always been a really bad studier, to be honest. Like I procrastinate, and I think the most effective studying I ever had was finding people whose personalities worked with mine. Like I found a group of like 3 guys, and we would get together for Sometimes before exams, like days before, but usually the morning before an exam. And we would just cram and quiz each other for like a couple hours before we took an exam. And that was probably the most effective studying for tests that I've ever had.
Sweet. Just a reminder, guys, if you want us to answer questions, do a super chat and we'll donate that money to Ray. Do you have a perspective on sex hormone binding globulin and what affects it?
Oh man, these are just coming from all angles.
Well, these are pretty. You can pass on this one because
I honestly, that's not something I've thought about for a really long time. I don't really have a perspective on that.
Another one is I was told that sugar is directly linked to gut inflammation, bacterial overgrowth, and a host of other negative inflammatory responses. What would you say the reason sugar is blamed for so many things, especially concerning the gut?
I would say the reason is that if there are, a higher population of whatever, bad bacteria, whatever people want to call it, and especially if your digestion is a little slow, so those two things, which are usually related, that sugar will feed those bacteria. So if they're there and you can't absorb the sugar fast enough, they will, get more of it and make more of whatever inflammatory byproduct they're going to make. But I wouldn't say that the sugar necessarily causes them to be there. Mm-hmm. So like if somebody has, there's so many reasons, like you could have a sluggish gut, you could have lower than optimal digestive secretions and allow bacteria to build up or be in parts of the gut that they're not supposed to be in. And in that case, yeah, sugar could make like an acute problem. It just gives them more energy. So that's why I think people that already have that problem, it just accentuates it. And if they don't eat sugar, then those bacteria will have less substrate to live on.
I forgot all the exact details, but Ray told me a story a while ago. I think he said it on air too, that like a publication would come out saying XYZ was harmful, and then he would get like an influx of people saying, whenever I do that thing, it's harmful. And so he was talking about kind of the marketing behind noticing various health problems and the industry just completely manipulating people to, I don't know, like to think that they were having specific problems. But as you know, like I don't know if you know, but like sometimes I've taken something and it's like, I've noticed the irritation like 2 or 3 days later. So it can be like super hard to detect if I ate something in XY, like a meal or whatever, to know precisely how that was affecting me much later. And that's why I think the only strategy is trying to like consume a nutrition plan out of like relatively safe foods, but that's really neither here nor there. Anything on that or next question?
No, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's like,
you're used to my monologuing.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously like people that pay attention to their health are going to skew towards like the hypochondriac, like personality type. So it's not difficult to convince somebody who is prone to being worried about something that like, oh my God, like you eat this? Oh, that's awful. Like, I bet it makes you feel bad. And it's like, yeah, surprise. Like next time they eat it, they feel bad. It could be from something else. It could be, psychological. It could be a combination of a bunch of things.
David B says, what factors influence the liver's capacity to store glycogen? What steps can someone take to support the restoration of optimal liver function?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. What factors influence the liver's capacity to store glycogen? And then what can somebody do to support the restoration or function of the liver?
Okay. So I don't remember all the enzymes in the whole like glycogen storage pathway, but I believe that the most normal, so there's a ton of things like people can genetically not be able to store glycogen in their liver, and they have to take, or actually there's a common condition, I forget what it's called, but they can store glycogen, but they can't release it.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to like go to sleep drinking like starch,
Mm-hmm.
or else they'll like become hypoglycemic in their sleep because they won't, you know what I mean? Their body won't. But normal people, the thing that will mess with your any liver function, and definitely glycogen storage and glycogen release, so they're both important because you have to be able to get to them, is when you start to get inflammation and fatty liver, the things that lead up to that, which would be, medically speaking, people would say like alcoholism, but non-alcoholic fatty liver. I think if you have, let's see, what are the different nutrients? I know Chris Masterjohn for a while was talking about choline deficiency, and but of course, choline deficiency or a deficiency in the ability to use choline to make phosphatidylcholine with fatty acids instead of triglycerides, that'll push all the fatty acids that your liver is taking up into triglycerides, some of which will be packaged into VLDL and sent out, and some of which will be, stored. And if that process gets pushed in that way enough, then you have a problem. So let's see, choline, probably vitamin A, sufficient vitamin A, really like everything in eggs. I think like every nutrient in an egg addresses liver function.
Sweet. Do you want to do calls or keep going on questions? And then we can pull the plug relatively soon.
Wait, so we're not going to talk about the mitochondria?
No, we are. Dude, I'll take this any direction you want. I felt like we kind of went over it, but I know we didn't go into it in great detail. Do you want to go through that?
Well, so I had like a whole.
I know.
But yeah, you know what though? It might kind of be like that should be a whole nother thing, actually.
I thought we were tiptoeing into it, and then I got flustered, and I think like we just like kind of went by it real quickly.
Yeah, well, because when I was talking about discussing the mitochondria, it was more like one of those classic like cartoons in the textbook, and like that kind of a thing, not like talking about like the way we were talking about it, where it's like, what the Randall cycle and what helps pull, glycolytic and pyruvate into the mitochondria versus fatty acids from beta oxidation, fatty acid substrate. But yeah, that's kind of a whole thing, because I had the whole like Ling. I was reading that Gilbert Ling paper, and he's just like, he's an animal, man.
Well, I mean, how do you want to talk about it? We've talked a lot about the standard model. Like, are there salient points about that Ling model that you think are important understanding? And again, I have those Pollock graphics to support the kind of the things that you're saying.
Well, they're salient. Most of them are salient in the sense of just like
salient, meaning that
interest.
Whatever you think is important.
Yeah. Well, there's two categories. So there's like the scientific interest part, which is just, are the models that people are using to explain cell physiology, are they the best to comport with like what we understand, from some kind of evidence or not? And then the other perspective would be like, in what way does this actually matter for health,
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think we've talked about it. Even though the model is completely different, it basically functions the same, right?
Yeah, well, the account keeping with things like ATP and NADH and FADH2 are basically work the same way with both models. Well, and because those aspects of it are pretty firmly established. Like, it's very clear that ATP gets made from ADP in the mitochondria. ATP gets used. The questions are, what is it doing when it gets used? What are the NADH and FADH2 doing to make it, in the respiratory enzymes? Like, how are they powering them? And what is that? Those are really the questions. But all of those molecules that are bouncing around this big system that's being discussed, the accounting is the same for all of those. I guess there's from the one perspective, there's a little bit more of a focus. From Ling's perspective, there's a little bit more of a focus on ions, positive cations, positively charged ions, and a little bit more on CO2. Whereas the kind of mainstream perspective mostly just looks at, NADH, FADH2, the respiratory enzymes, oxygen, and CO2 is just seen as a waste product. It's not important. And like the proton gradient, I guess, which is not really a molecule.
Well, I'd be interested in your perspective on that. I do have that graphic up in Pollack's book, The Gels, Cells, and the Engines of Life. And the way I was introed into this was that pumps and channels idea just basically being fraudulent. And what was the idea? Like there's not enough energy to like there's a certain amount of ions in and outside the cell, and you can't account for them by pumps and channels and things. And it also showed how Pollack showed how there was like a many assumptions based on other assumptions until you had a model of the cell that just was like completely out of touch with reality.
Right. So that discussion mainly focuses around the sodium potassium pump as like the main really like function of the cell, or the way that it gets its energy to do everything that it does. And also the proton pump feature of the mitochondrial. So it's kind of like a microcosm. Like the mitochondrial proton pump is a microcosmic model of the whole cell sodium potassium pump. They're basically the same thing, but one of them uses ATP to pump in potassium and pump out sodium, and the other one uses those energy, the NADH and FADH2, to pump protons across a membrane, and then they flow back in through this like whirly-gig and make ATP.
Are you talking about the respiratory enzyme contraptions or the ATPases or whatever?
The ATPase,
yeah,
yes.
Okay, yeah. It's like a big machine, like complicated organic machine that they like.
It's like an engine
yeah.
with planks that like spin around. It's very bizarre, like, because when you think about things that small, like the mechanical forces, like people talk about like, quantum molecules and they don't behave the same way. But even at that size, mechanical forces that we think of are really not happening. Like there's electrical interactions that are happening in ways that, like if our macro world behaved that way, things would be weird. Like you'd be able to like move things from a distance. You know what I mean? Like because the relative magnitude of electric charge to matter size at that level is so much higher that there's like actions at a distance electrically, and everything, basically everything mechanical is electric already. We just can't tell because all those forces get averaged out, and then we have like solid matter, but it's really all like an electrical force. But at that level, to think that there's a thing that kind of looks like a water mill or like a windmill or an engine it's not that it's impossible, but it's just kind of like a weird, desperate attempt to apply like, I guess a kind of common sense, or it has to be, this makes sense to me, so I'm going to like make this as a model and then come up with ways to confirm this, and then we'll just kind of say this is how it works.
Well, I mean, I might need not even have the tools to understand this, but how does the Ling model change the electron transport chain or the proton pumping? Like, what? I don't have any reference for
right.
that.
Well, so first of all, okay, so do you have all right, so you have the Pollack thing.
Yeah, and
I'm gonna just give you just a normal figure of like you could just put any kind of figure of what is that? Is that the TCA cycle?
Where are you where are you looking?
I put it in Skype.
Oh,
No, I just took a picture of this.
nice.
Yeah, I'm hitting like levels of boomer tech that shouldn't even be possible. All right,
We're
so
just gonna roll with it, you know.
yeah, that's not even what I wanted. But actually, can you just search like on a browser mitochondrial structure?
Yes.
And just throw up the first thing you see. It should be fine. Just to have
like the cartoon versions, or
yeah, the cartoon.
okay. How about this one? Or let me make a actually big graphic. Okay, we'll do
Nice.
this. Okay.
I'm still waiting for it to come up for me. Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
Okay, so the mainstream model is, so there's two membranes. The one of them, the outer one, is the one that looks like a pill. Like it's like kind of, that looks like a pill.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be the pill outer, the capsule.
Mm-hmm.
And then the inner membrane is that thing that goes wavy like, and it looks almost like like you get
Day, right? Yeah, Chris Day. Yeah.
yeah, that's what they're called.
Yeah.
Is the folds. It increases surface area. So that's the inner membrane. That's where all of this action takes place. The outer membrane is just completely like not even discussed. So in the inner membrane, inside the inner membrane, so on the inside surface that's facing that blue stuff,
Mm-hmm.
Those are where the respiratory proteins are.
Okay.
They're studded into that inner membrane, facing in.
Okay.
So what happens is you go through the TCA cycle with either stuff from glucose or stuff from fatty acids or equivalents from amino acids, and you get the NADH and the FADH2. And those travel through the enzyme system. And in the mainstream model, they go from enzyme to enzyme and they get electrons pulled off. And they get reoxidized as NAD plus and FAD. And the energy of removing those electrons pumps protons, so hydrogen atoms without an electron, through these enzymes, through this membrane, this inner membrane that is otherwise impermeable or extremely close to impermeable of these hydrogen ions, of the protons. So you develop this chemical gradient, and they want to reestablish through diffusion, an equal amount of hydrogen ions on either side of the membrane. And as luck would have it, there is a little hole that they can go through that's connected to the ATPase. And as they go through, it does like a windmill or a water mill or whatever type action, that the force of them going back through turns it, which is really what they say. It creates like a mechanical force, and this mechanical energy powers the enzyme to phosphorylate ADP into ATP. So to add the third phosphate. And that's it. That is the that's how, and Ling has like a series of critiques, and most of the critiques are really just talking about the early work that people considered, that created this model, and how these people, they actually had a lot of trouble because they can't account for it. Like there's the chemical gradient is not enough. So they have to also say, oh, well, it also produces an electrical gradient. Mm-hmm. So every time a proton goes up, a hydroxide, which would be like the other half of water, that's negatively charged, comes down. So now there's a negative potential, kind of like inside of the cell. It's all the same model. So inside the inner membrane, there's a negative potential. And so not only do the hydrogen ions want to diffuse through the ATPase because there's no hydrogen ions inside and there's a lot outside, but actually not even outside, but in the inner membrane, like in between the two surfaces of the inner membrane, like as if, you've got an inner tube, and if you pierced the inner tube, so the place where the air is, that's where the hydrogen ions are going. So there's also that electrical gradient that's drawing these positively charged protons back in. And, people try to do measurements, and Ling wrote that, I forget what the magnitude was, but it was like orders of magnitude not enough to account for what's going on. And that if you did create that gradient, the electrical potential would be like way, way bigger than you could have. It's like not a workable system.
What is the electrical potential? Like why does that matter in the mitochondria?
So an electrical potential is when you have some type of barrier that prevents, whether it's electrons or ions, so molecules that carry charge, a barrier that prevents them from moving and equilibrating, so that you can have a different charge on one side of the barrier than the other.
Okay.
So that an electrical potential is a difference in charge. And that's how you get shocked. So like if you touch something that has a bunch of charged particles that can now go into you, that's what they do. So in the cell, in the model of the cell, is you have this membrane, and the same thing with the mitochondria. And there's the inside and outside. And instead of electrons, like in electronics that we use to create electricity, ions can be used. So like sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, magnesium. And they're not quite as good because they're bigger. They have the same charge as an electron. Well, some of them have +2, but most of them are +1. And electrons -1, but electrons are like infinitely small. So that's why electronics are, you can do more than, like they're faster, like a robot is faster than a person. So, because electrons can move faster than ions. But anyway, so you have, if you take these ions, positively charged ions, and you kick them out so that they can't come back in, whatever the charge was inside and outside, now you have taken positive charge out of the inside and put it outside. So you've created an electrical potential. So like, say minus, I think inside the cell, they say it's like -70 millivolts.
Okay.
Is the normal electrical potential, resting potential. I think Gilbert Ling, he also said that the inner mitochondrial membrane is permeable. That like all the studies showed that if you kind of just have it sit there and put protons, they'll pass through, because you can measure the passing through with a pH meter. So the pH will just start to go up on the one side. And then also there's less, so the model of it is that it's got this lipid, that it's a lipid bilayer, like in the cell,
In the cell or the mitochondria?
Both. So the mitochondrial membrane is like the cell membrane. It's basically the same model. And the problem is that if the inner mitochondrial membrane is impermeable to these small ions like protons and other small ions, but the outer membrane is permeable, because that's what the model is they say the outer membrane is mostly permeable, the inner membrane is mostly impermeable. The problem with that is the outer membrane has a higher percentage of phospholipid than the inner membrane. The inner membrane is like something like 80% protein and like 20% phospholipid. And the outer membrane is like 50-50. It's like 50% phospholipid and 50% other stuff. So that just doesn't make sense. So you can imagine so there's a lipid bilayer of those phospholipids. So the fatty acids are the things in the middle of the squiggly lines. And the phosphate is on the outside, those balls. So the inner membrane is supposed to have more of that to be less permeable to ions, but it actually has less. It's less dense. So those proteins, those things in blue, there's more of that per those other things in the inner membrane than in the outer membrane. Which would
in the inner mitochondrial membrane versus the cellular. Okay.
versus the outer mitochondrial membrane.
Okay.
That was just a critique that Gilbert Ling had.
Well, I don't know if this is here or there, but what wasn't one of his major critiques that ATP had more, I don't know what better word for it, but like power not being broken down to ADP, and because it was his cardinal adsorbent par excellence, and so, but I don't fully understand that.
Well, that's on the use side.
Uh-huh.
So the mitochondrial metabolism side is on the production side.
Okay.
So taking ADP to ATP. So his model basically is like this whole pump thing. It's just not tenable. The membrane that it's supposed to be pumping against is too permeable to get a powerful gradient. It would require way too much power to get the chemical and electrical gradients that they're talking about to do this chemical reaction. Basically, at every level, the very, very basic like chemistry doesn't seem to support it. So his model is that I think he wrote that one of the early discoveries was that magnesium and potassium were so there's a two-step process, the ATPase. So he believes the ATPase protein is real.
Pollock does too, yeah. Because he says that you can see them, so you do have to like explain them, I guess.
Right. Because they basically don't think the sodium potassium pump is real, or they think that it's just kind of a mislabeled protein that is, basically shouldn't be called that. But they do agree that there is a protein, within the respiratory chain that's connected to it, to these other enzymes, the cytochrome enzymes, et cetera, that is, responsible for making ATP. And they say how it does it is, when it was studied, it's a two-step process. So the enzyme itself gets a phosphate just from the inner membrane, the matrix is what it's called. And so then it becomes a phosphoenzyme. It's a phosphorylated enzyme. And that step is associated with adsorbance of magnesium and or potassium. And then the second step is transferring that phosphate from the enzyme to an ADP to make the ATP. And that step is associated with calcium and or sodium being adsorbed to the protein. So the model is that the NADH and FADH2 is moving through the respiratory chain and having electrons pulled off of it as per the other model. But instead of doing this proton pumping action, it is making the respiratory enzymes shift their conformation, shift their shape, and they're physically connected to the ATPase, and it changes its shape that makes it favorable to bind magnesium or potassium. And that once it binds one of those two cations, phosphate can bind to the ATPase. And so it grabs a phosphate. And
that's all mediated by water, right? Within the cell.
Yes, but not liquid water.
Yeah. The
bulk water. The kind of water that if you had like Jello and you shook it.
Speaking of,
you got some Jello?
Well, no, this is one of the graphics from the book, and I don't like it's kind of interesting because he starts with a pack of Jello, and then he shows how water associates with the protein, and then he sprinkles some salt on it and shows how the salt associates with the proteins. And again, I am so far away from understanding this, but it kind of makes sense how things are like self-regulated via water, the proteins and the alkaline minerals and things. Did that show up for you?
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now.
Do you think this is what you're right?
Yeah, right. So in Jello or any kind of gelatin product, when you make it, you mix together this packet of mostly proteins. If it's like Jello, then it's also got sugar and like food dye or whatever, with water. And then when it sets, it becomes like a jiggly thing that is obviously not liquid water anymore. You can't pour it. But so what happened to the water? So what happened is, in that middle circle, all of those waters, for water to flow, there has to be way more distance between water molecules and solid surfaces than that. Mm-hmm. There has to be like dozens or hundreds of, maybe even thousands of water molecules between two surfaces for them to interact the way we think of as liquid water. Mm-hmm. So like if you put your hand in a glass of water or whatever in a lake, there's billions of water molecules that you're swishing through when you move it around. Mm-hmm. But if you took 2 glass microscope slides mm-hmm. and put like a drop of water on them and pushed them together and like smashed it, the slides stick together. You can't pull them apart because the water is so packed that its electric behavior, when it connects the surface of the one glass slide to the other one, is totally different. It creates this like solid type of behavior. And in Jell-O, or any of that stuff, it's not as solid as that because there's more space mm-hmm. Between those proteins. Like obviously, in our skin and stuff, like with the collagen and our cells, they're not as rigid as 2 glass slides. But the less water molecules there are between surface and surface, the stronger and more different the water's behavior is than what we think of as liquid water, bulk water.
And Pollack wrote, that's the 4th phase of water book that he wrote. Yeah. He talked about all those different types of experiments. And like, isn't it the same thing when the beakers, when they like stretch them with the water bridge or whatever? Is that a similar thing?
Yes, because there's a certain amount of water where if you stretch it too far, it'll start to act more like liquid water and fall mm-hmm. down. But mm-hmm. yeah, and depending on like what you can put solutes in there, or you can put little things that act as like solid surfaces for them to connect to, and you can extend that.
They're like electrifying doing something else to it though, right? I forget. Aren't they charging the water or something?
I don't remember what all of his experiments were. I mean, he has like a water battery. He has all kinds of things using water and using all different techniques to exploit it. But as far as the cell is concerned, it's mostly a surface phenomenon that is electrical at the surface. That
guy rules. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'm sure you're a little bit behind, but I don't know what that machine is, but he's like charging it in some way or something.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know what it is either. It's probably,
I'm sure he says what it is. Oh, yeah. Whatever. Keep going.
Well, I think nice. I think we basically, explained the colloidal water phenomenon. So just to finish up, the mitochondrial thing, because we were at step 1. So step 1 is adsorbing phosphate to the ATPase, the same ATPase that is supposedly getting powered by this proton pump. But instead of that, it's just complexing, it's adsorbing, because that's what proteins do. They attract and tuck into their little pockets, because they're these big kind of full of crevices. Compared to ions, proteins are huge. Mm-hmm. They're like mountains, and the ions are like people. So imagine like people can like, get into crevices and mountains and stick in there. So they pull in these ions, and that changes their shape. So as their shape changes, they can adsorb different things, which then change their shape more. So it's this whole continual process. It's not really discrete. Like I'm discussing it in 2 steps, but it's really more like a wave rather than like a digital 1 and then 2.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt. Isn't that why you see the newer footage of cells? They're just like crazy looking, and they're like kind of like they look like
vibrating.
They just look like they're moving all over the place, and that's kind of what you're talking about, the conformation changes, right?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Like that for the whole cell, because the whole cell is mostly a bunch of protein with water in that kind of jello configuration. You're constantly like doing these reactions and shuttling small molecules and everything around. So so you've got the ATPase that has a phosphate on it, and then because it's reduced. So it was reduced by NADH and FADH2. So they carried electrons to the respiratory enzymes, gave their electrons away, and they became oxidized. And then they go off so that they can be recycled again as NAD plus and FAD. And then in order to oxidize the whole system, that's what the quinones and the iron sulfur proteins are. So the other things in the mitochondria, other than the respiratory proteins, there's a couple of other things. There's a bunch of quinone proteins hanging around, and there's iron sulfur proteins, and they serve as like electron sinks. So they'll then take that and shuttle it towards the production of water, and complexing water with CO2 to make bicarbonate and to do all that kind of stuff. That's how they get rid of the electrons. And then so the whole system, the respiratory enzyme system, becomes reoxidized, and then that changes the configuration of the ATPase again to adsorb calcium and sodium instead of magnesium and potassium, and that conformational change kicks off the phosphate and puts it onto an ADP to make ATP. And that's one cycle. And so that's the model.
And then that metabolism was interfered with, that would redistribute the ion concentration inside and outside the cell.
Right. And I mean, it has a lot of, most of the salient points are pretty much the same as the mainstream model. But it's, we were talking about earlier about NAD plus and NADH and the ratio, and that got really popular a couple of years ago because it seems to be a pretty good indicator of health, and that the ratio gets, the NADH increases in proportion to NAD plus as people get less healthy and old.
Well, is that not a fringe idea? I mean, because
no,
okay,
it's not fringe, because it's very clear, like all of the data, it's just not discussed because the big ideas in the space, like things that become really big, like sugar is bad or like saturated fat is bad, like the big ideas, there isn't a framework to put this in. So like it can't be blamed on like a big macronutrient. It can't be, nobody's figured out how to frame it, like you listen to that Matt Blackburn thing, right? That I talked to him. Yeah. So how like language, like there's a language to science, and depending on what people are, the things that are popular, the scientific techniques that are being used the most and that are considered the most valid, they drive what types of questions are interesting and how to frame things. So there really is no way to ask this question in a way that it can become really popular. But it is not controversial to say that a low NAD plus to NADH ratio is a sign of poor health.
Well, I didn't ask you, but like when that in the mitochondria, when all the things that we talked about are happening, where's the NAD and because most of the NAD is being produced on the business end of respiration through the electron transport chain. A little bit of NAD is produced in glycolysis, and then the NADH is produced in the TCA cycle. Is that right?
Well, okay, so NADH and FADH2 are both produced in glycolysis, beta oxidation, the TCA cycle. And they're basically just so these molecules that go around NAD plus and FAD, they pick up high energy electrons as the glucose or the fatty acid substrate is broken down. So they're broken down 2 carbons at a time, and every time that happens, they get put on the an acetyl CoA and sent through the TCA cycle, and it breaks them down into basically carbon dioxide, one step at a time, and every step closer. So carbon dioxide is basically maximally oxidized carbon, and glucose and fatty acids and a couple of other energy substrates are like maximally reduced. So as they go from maximally reduced to completely oxidized, they give off those reductive electrons to NAD plus and FAD. And that's what makes NADH and FADH2.
But the NAD is just a reflection of like the intensity of the mitochondrial metabolism. Is that right?
Well, so if you have a lot of NADH, right, to NAD, then what that's saying is that the NADH is getting made, so you're like burning energy substrate, but your respiratory chain enzymes are not working fast enough to keep up with it. So it's like a bottleneck.
I might sound real stupid for a second, but isn't the pyruvate, if the pyruvate dehydrogenase is blocked, is it the pyruvate can be donated to NADH and that makes the NAD? Is that right? Because
I think electrons can be donated to it. It's not the whole pyruvate.
Can't pyruvate become like a sink? Okay, I'm getting tired. Okay.
Yeah. No, a pyruvate is a reductive substrate. It's a relatively reduced substrate. And when you make lactate with it, you can, that is a relatively oxidized compared to pyruvate. So yeah, you can make NADH from that. You can make these things from any, like if you made chemically, hydrogen peroxide from water, you can make NADH from that. Or conversely, you can make NAD by quenching hydrogen peroxide into water with NADH. That's actually a reaction I do in the lab to measure hydrogen peroxide amount or creation.
Have you ever seen anybody do that blood test? Georgie's talked about that, the NAD to NADH ratio, but I've never seen anybody actually get that test done.
No, I haven't. Maybe next time I go to a doctor, I'll ask for it. I'm sure they'll be like, what?
People routinely tell me that their doctors will not order the prolactin test for them because they're male. Like, it's a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, I've had maybe people just tell me the bad stories, but like one of my friends just said that he wanted to get IGF-1 tested, and the doctor didn't even know what that was. And that's not like a weird thing. That's like people that go on like bodybuilding.com know about.
No, also it's like it's publicized via its alleged role in cancer and things. So like it's more popular than I feel like other things.
Yeah, it's a basic it's something that you would have come across in a lot of classes in medical school and
it's like a vegan talking point for lowering protein is to lower your IGF-1 because it's so bad,
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty bad. My mom's endocrinologist didn't know that you could have low TSH and low T3. Like she just thought that was categorically impossible. Which is funny because that's not even a Ray Peat thing. Like in endocrinology textbooks, they have primary, secondary, and tertiary thyroid, hypothyroidism. So primary is when the thyroid gland itself isn't producing thyroid hormone. And secondary is when the pituitary isn't producing TSH, and tertiary is when the hypothalamus isn't producing TRH. And of course, from the Ray Peat perspective, there's like other ways to think of it. But even just that, if you had like a tertiary problem where your hypothalamus is underactive, then you would have low TSH because TRH stimulates TSH. So you would have low TSH, but you'd also have low T3 because the whole system isn't being stimulated. And this person just, I don't know, isn't aware of that or whatever.
I didn't get it. I didn't capture it, but do you know who Ted Naiman is? A low carb person?
No.
Anyways, a very opinionated gentleman, but he's talking about like thyroid. And again, he's a low carb advocate, and he was talking about how if you get your TSH and your free T4 tested, that's really all you'd ever need to assess the thyroid function. So those kind of ideas live on even in alt medicine, you know. But my whole journey was based on thinking that the physicians didn't know what they were talking about, because they'd always tell me my thyroid was fine with a TSH of 3 and things. So, I mean, yeah.
Well, if it's within their range, you know.
But Ray's pointed to the American Association of Endocrinology, and they have a range of 0.3 to 3. But again, if you're a doctor and you are slammed, you know, it's like, how often do you read about the new standards for TSH and what it all means and stuff? So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's really disappointing. They just go down the there's like most of those charts I think have red numbers when the numbers are outside of the normal. So they don't even have to think. It's just like color coded for them. So their eyes know where to go on paper. Like I'm wondering like why they even require a degree to do this job. Because it's almost like, you know what I mean? It's like it's color coded for them. Like,
well, again, it was Ray's, not his most recent newsletter, but the one before that was criticizing the so-called evidence-based medicine for just the reasons that you're talking about. It's like it's like a specific model they're talking about being the evidence based off of, and then any kind of artistic diagnoses is just obliterated, you know, based on these tests that have a bunch of problems, you know.
Right. Yeah. Evidence-based medicine is like so crazy because it sounds like such a good idea.
Yeah. It's such like a misnomer for a name of what it is.
Yeah. Because it really is like, wait, what's the other medicine based on?
It must be that quackery type of anti-vax medicine.
Yeah.
It's funny you touch on that, because before I ever found Ray, I was into like skeptical podcasts, and I listened to like 3 or 4 of them. And one of the 2 people on a skeptic podcast were part of a website that I'm pretty sure was called Evidence-Based Medicine. And so they would always take the new medical trends and dissect them. And for whatever reason, I liked listening to them. And then at one point, one of the skeptics, I don't know if I probably told you this before, but he broke down a Big Mac meal from McDonald's, and his whole point was like, this is actually pretty nutritious. And I was like, dude, these guys are so out of touch with reality that it's like that they're trying to portray a Big Mac as being not that being like a good meal option, basically. And so it was, again, like seeing that total incongruence. Like it made sense until they said this completely wacky thing that was like a huge red flag to this being total nonsense, you know?
Yeah, that's a weird thing to say.
I think it was the Skeptoid podcast, and that guy went on Joe Rogan's show one time, and Joe Rogan like tore him apart. Do you know who I'm talking about? His name's David Dunning, I think. No. It's like a famous Joe Rogan episode. You should watch it. You got to keep up on your Joe Rogan, man.
I'll get right. Yeah, I know. I'm like, I'm deficient in, what is it? DMT and like 5-HTP, or what is it? Alpha brain.
Alpha brain. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really depressing that he's like selling serotonin precursor.
I haven't looked what's in that. Is 5-HTP in there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's like the active ingredient.
Yeah, I need to check that out. That is, I mean, that's the problem with selling supplements, you know, but okay.
Well, he's never gonna, because he's in that like keto, like fasting kind of like stress is good thing. So I don't think he's ever going to have to walk that back, because I don't think he's ever going to, you know, the people that he has on his podcast.
Well, I don't, to my knowledge, besides people that are vegan, he's never had a pro-carb person like that could say anything intelligent about it, you know? So the one kind of thing I feel like, and it's true for at least you and I think, is you want to be progressive, like in a sense. You want to keep going. You want to like keep trying to figure out what is real and what's not real. And like I know some people have that drive. And so again, it's like the love affair with keto or carnivore. It's great for the moment, but if you have that will of figuring out what's if there's more to the equation, like you can't, it's like impossible to sit still. You have to move in a different direction. And so even now I feel like at least I won't name the name, but I think there's one. I wouldn't be surprised if some people from the carnivore scene defected in the next few years. It will just be like veganism. People will start dropping at a certain time, you know, because like I said, not to be redundant, but people like being progressive. Some people do, you know, if you don't want to blend into the scene and be a total nobody, you know.
Yeah, you can almost see people laying the groundwork for like, you know, with well, really the first apostate, and he was never really, you know, a dedicated true believer, was Chris Masterjohn. Like he came out really early saying, I do not advocate a particular macronutrient ratio. He never said carbs are bad. He just said saturated fat and cholesterol are not bad.
Again, Chris is my friend, love him to death, and I think he's one of my favorite resources. The one thing that I think is mildly vexing is that he's never took a hard stance on anything. And so maybe that's the good part about him, but at the same time, I think it's kind of hard to see where okay, maybe I'm wrong or showing my biases, but some things have to be harmful, you know? Like I at some point you have to call a spade at some point. And I think he's, again, I could be wrong. I'd love to talk to him about it. Chris, you're welcome to come on here if you ever listen to this. But I think he's resistant to, because he is kind of married to the essential fatty acid idea, and that is part of his history. And I've never seen him walk that back, but maybe he doesn't want to walk it back or whatever. But I don't know.
Well, he has taken a hard stance on choline. He's very pro choline. So you can't call him a milquetoast person on everything. I think he has a hard stance on vitamin K. He's pro vitamin K.
You know what? I'll take that back because I do. His carbon dioxide stuff is great, but again, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, well, I think I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he'd say, oh, well, some things are good for ketosis, some things aren't. You know, would you agree with that from what you've seen?
Yeah.
I think he'd say it would have its place, where I would like go out on a limb and say it's probably never useful unless
he might not say that. He might not say it has its place. He might just say, if you're going to do that, he might say, I can see why people would do that, or maybe it's effective for weight loss, which is true, you know, for a lot of people, that you want to do X, Y, and Z to make sure you're not deficient. You know what I mean? Like because I think there's a certain wisdom in that, because it's very difficult to divert people away from something like veganism or low carb when they're getting into it.
So caveat, my dad just told me he's into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin, I guess that is associated with carnivore diet. You know, I don't know how, but my dad was like, I'm eating carnivore. But like, based on what I knew he ate before, which was like probably just total fast food bullshit, I wasn't going to talk him out of it. You know, I was like, great, my dad is doing something to try experiment, you know, in a way that he's never done in 64 years, you know? So I guess what I'm trying to say is like about the academic, even though I'm not in academia, but like the kind of granular way of talking about health, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that association is because of this guy, Saifuddin Ammous. He wrote this book called The Bitcoin Standard, which is like an argument for why Bitcoin is going to become the like the currency of the reserve currency of the world, or of final settlement. And he's a carnivore, and there's like groups. He kind of created this movement. There's this guy Tone Vace that talks about trading, but he has a channel trading Bitcoin, and he's on the carnivore diet. And they have like get-togethers, like Bitcoin carnivore people. Yeah,
that makes
it's
so
like
much more sense now.
Yeah, it's like they're cool people, you know. If I met one of them, I wouldn't be like, "Hey, man, you gotta like get off carnivore." Like, that would just be kind of lame.
Again, there's different ways to approach it, but like a person doing anything to improve their health from the standard American stuff is probably beneficial, you know. And I think we've said that like 2 or 3 times. So
there's a super chat question.
Oh yeah, I was gonna do them at the very, very, very end, but we should probably do them now. Okay, Ellie says, "How's it going?" with a GIF. Thank you, Ellie. Steph for $31.41. Thank you so much, Steph. You're amazing. You're the best moderator ever. And Somo says, Kyle, can you clarify the difference between lipolysis and fat oxidation, also reesterification? Keto and RP followers use these terms incorrectly.
Okay, so lipolysis is when usually triglycerides, but I guess it could be used to also describe diglyceride or phospholipid lysis. So it's just when fatty acids are liberated from larger molecules that contain fatty acids. So it's the liberation of fatty acids. It's usually used in a macro metabolic context to mean that the adipocytes that store, our fatty acids as triglycerides, that hormone sensitive lipase is being recruited by, something like a stress hormone or a low glycemic situation to get into the lipid droplets, which is where the triglycerides are stored, and start to pull the triglycerides out of those lipid droplets and then lyse them into individual fatty acids. So that's usually the context. And oxidation, on the other hand, metabolic oxidation is what we were talking about this whole time in the mitochondria. So that's when they're being used. So lipolyzed fatty acids, they don't have to become oxidized. I mean, they could be put, some of them are going to get released and end up getting, as the question stated, reesterified. So some of these things are always doing small amounts of futile cycling because there's no way to really partition things going in and coming out. Enzymes just get turned up and down in their relative magnitude or presence and activity. So some of them will end up getting made into phospholipids, or even as fatty acids are getting broken down, like I said before, with the malonyl-CoA, some of the stepwise products of beta oxidation will get pulled off to make all kinds of stuff. You can make a little bit of glucose that way, not a lot.
Glycerol?
Well, the glycerol, yeah, but I was talking about specifically the fatty acid. You can make a little bit of glucose from fatty acids. Okay. It's a very small, almost, textbooks will say that that gluconeogenesis can only happen from amino acids and a couple other things. Mm-hmm. But there's like a very small, basically physiologically irrelevant, but there is some amount of glucose that can get made from fatty acids. Pentoses, they're like things that aren't as significant as the other sugars. They can get made. And reesterification is just the opposite of lipolysis. It's reattaching fatty acids, mostly to a glycerol.
And not necessarily related to the question, but the fatty acids are also interfering with like albumin, I guess, and knocking or blocking albumin from like associating with, like, I think thyroxine and tryptophan, maybe.
Yeah, well, they compete with it. So it's like a kinetic, like when there's an enzyme, and in this case, kinetically speaking, a transport protein works the same as an enzyme. Like if there's more substrate, it works faster in the sense like a certain amount of these enzymes will pick up that substrate and transport them faster. And if there's competing substrate, then less, they will compete. And there's a certain binding constant that the different, usually different substrates have slightly different affinities that they fit better with the proteins. So one will outcompete another, depending on different factors. So yeah, I think that's mainly a competition issue.
Sweet. Okay, I think we got another super chat. This one's from GX Junior 007 499. Thank you so much. And thank you for that last question, Somo. They say, how much saturated fat should one consume in a meal before it starts interfering with sugar oxidation and endotoxin production?
I don't know.
I don't know that either. I think Ray was asked, and I can't recall his answer, but he thought that endotoxin idea was like propaganda, basically, the saturated fat. But I know you've mentioned it. You've done a lot more reading about it than I have.
Yeah. It's a tricky situation, but it appears that so the saturated fats, because of their nature, being more hydrophilic, they make these more effective lipid rafts, which they're kind of like micelles, and there's all these little structures that fatty acids and other hydrophobic molecules will make because they'll get pushed together from the electrical interactions of the mostly aqueous hydrophilic stuff surrounding it. And saturated fats, they make these things lipid rafts, which kind of shuttle things across. And one of the things that it seems like they can shuttle across is endotoxin, because that has a decent portion of it is lipophilic or hydrophobic. And that's unfortunate, but that seems to be the reason why a lot of studies were showing on the molecular level that saturated fat was inflammatory, because pretty much all reagents, unless they're very carefully produced and then treated with chemicals that remove endotoxin, because most lab reagents, like say amino acids or vitamins, like if you're using flavins, like a riboflavin or any kind of flavin compound, they're mostly made biochemically by bacteria. So you'll have like a big vat of bacteria that has been genetically engineered to produce a ton of lysine, the amino acid lysine. And so you feed the bacteria and let them ferment, and then you go through a series of purification steps to get the lysine amino acid out of the medium and all the bacteria. But these bacteria that produce it, they're usually E. coli, because they're the ones that have had their genomes manipulated the most. And they also produce endotoxin. And that's really hard to get out completely. So there's usually, unless great care is taken, trace amounts of endotoxin. And if you mix that with saturated fats in a medium, it will shuttle that endotoxin around and to different enzymes. And there's these receptors that are designed to pick up endotoxin. And apparently they can get there more efficiently in the presence of saturated fats.
Sweet. Okay, should we take a few callers and then end this thing?
Yeah, sure. Are people still like
we
watching
still have 58 people watching.
Oh.
Thank you guys. As always, please subscribe, like, leave a comment. Okay, let me put up the number. Oh, I took it down.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, here's the number. Let me open up Skype and how do I work this? Okay, I'm available for a call, so you should be able to call in, I think. Really have no idea how this is going to go. Oh, we already have a call.
Whoa.
I don't hear any sound from Skype. Let's see. Hello? Can you hear us? Hello?
Hey.
Hey,
Danny.
you're on the air with Danny and Kyle. What's up?
Hey guys, this is Ricky.
Hey,
from
Ricky, how are you,
Texas again.
sir? You're on the air with Danny and Kyle.
Oh, let me put the volume down. Sorry, so you don't get echo.
Thank you.
So, quick question. Sometimes, well, actually today, I just took amoxicillin, antibiotic, and I felt like spaced out. I only took I cut it in half. It's 500 milligrams. I felt spaced out. It's kind of a scary feeling. There was no pain involved, but it was a really scary feeling, and spaced out. It's like weird. I can't really describe it. Almost fainty, a little bit of dizzy, but it's hard to describe it. It was scary. I'm sorry?
What were you taking it for? The amoxicillin?
For IBS. I have gut issues.
Okay. Well, that's most likely the die-off, right? Is that what you would say, Danny? Like if you have an infection, like in the gut, or a high titer of bacteria, and you kill all of them at once, they will be destroyed and release their compounds.
You would know better than I would. The only thing I'd say is that upon taking any antibiotic, there's tends to be a few days in the beginning where it's kind of chaotic or things go haywire, digestive wise, or loose stools or what have you, that tend to resolve after that. But Ricky, how long did you say you're on them for?
Oh, I just happened today. I only took half because I was like, you know how I guess the rule of thumb is start slow or start low. So I cut the 500 milligram pill in half. I just bit it.
Yeah, Kyle has a good science explanation, but I feel like it's like the wild, wild west when you introduce an antibiotic into whatever is happening like in your stomach. But yeah, feeling spaced out or whatever doesn't shock me or surprise me at all, for sure. I think Ray said you could have a allergy to like dying bacteria in your stomach, and that could cause diarrhea or whatever.
Yeah, a lot of the bacterial products that like endotoxin or there's some other things other than lipopolysaccharide, like lipoproteins, different, I think like glucans and all kinds of stuff, glyco, whatever. A lot of those get released when the bacteria die. So you're getting a steady amount of them when you're having a problem. And then if you kill a bunch of them all at once, you'll get all of that in one big shot.
Gotcha. So my understanding is endotoxin can only be released through going number 2, Val?
Yeah, well, I think in circulation it can get kind of sopped up by LDL, and it can get gobbled up if it's identified by macrophages. But in terms of the gut, yeah, it either gets absorbed into your system or it gets excreted.
Okay. Gotcha.
One thing that can, like charcoal, activated charcoal, can adsorb the bacteria and the endotoxin. It's just sometimes the bacteria has like a biofilm and the charcoal can't get to it. So it doesn't always work. But things like that. Would carrot
work in place of charcoal or raw carrot?
Where can you get it?
Oh, I'm saying, would the raw carrot do the same thing what you just described with charcoal or not?
I don't know. Annie?
I don't know either, but I've mimicked Ray when he said that he would actually eat carrot and then eat the antibiotic. And apparently, I think the reasoning was that the carrot would soak up some of the antibiotic and bring it into the large intestine or something, maybe more effortlessly or something.
Interesting. Okay.
Cool, brother.
Would it be one more question?
Yeah.
What do you think about, like, I think the gentleman there said something about microphage or something like that. Taking this thing is called Myroviridae. I think it's a biophage or something like that. Is that,
I can't
are you
understand.
familiar with it?
Macrophage or bacteriophage?
Yeah, something like that. It's something that they discovered they use to help with like E. coli and things like that.
I think it's bacteriophages. That was something Ray
Right,
mentioned that is like now available in Life Extension, and then another company called Andrew something Pharmaceuticals. If you type in bacteriophage into Amazon, there's like 2 products. Yeah. And Ray seems to be a pretty big fan of them, and I know some people really like them. But the flora... Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, you wouldn't take that with antibiotics together, like separately?
I've never taken them together, to be honest. But I did write a company that made flora, a bacteriophage, and they said that it would be good to take it with a megaspore biotic-like product. And so they said that there was some kind of synergy between bacteriophages and then the B. licheniformis, the C. clausi, or I'm such an idiot. What are the other strains?
I don't know. I don't have the label in front of me.
Oh, B. subtilis is what I was thinking. But yeah, those are over the counter, so they're just easier to get than antibiotics, and so it can just be less of a headache.
Okay, cool. Thanks, gentlemen.
Cool, Ricky. Always a pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Bye, Ricky.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we'll take one more. Hello, you are on the air with Kyle and Danny. What's up?
Hello.
Hey.
Thoughts on high altitude living? I know Ray has talked about it. He lived in Mexico City and said his health deteriorated. Many similar theorists talked about high altitude increasing CO2 in the tissues. But according to many people who have lived at high altitude, they've had health problems that they've not adapted to at higher altitudes. So in terms of direct experience and not just, analytical studies on lower cancer rates at altitude, do you have any ideas on what would help someone adapt and what the realities are of energy availability at higher altitudes?
Kyle?
Well, I've never lived at a higher altitude. Literally the only personal experience I have with it is family members that live in Boulder, and I visited them, and I didn't get altitude sickness or anything like that. I was a little worried about it, actually, but it was fine, and I wasn't really engaged in any exercise, so I can't say whether it changed my like aerobic ability. But I do know that when those family members visit, like one of them jogs, and she can jog for a lot longer at sea level. So the whole, like, all I know is just athletically. I've never,
Right.
I don't know about their health. They seem to be fine, the people that I know that live in Boulder.
And Danny, you live at higher altitude?
Yeah, it's like it would be so hard for me to make some like authoritative statement about it because so much changed when I moved from San Francisco to here. The only relevant factoid, I think, I've kind of suspected that my nutritional requirements probably increased when I'm here, but I couldn't tell you that's because of the altitude. Like I have no idea why that is. It just feels like in my brain, it seems like I need to eat liver and oysters more often, or I won't necessarily feel the way I want to feel. And the only other thing is the few times when I wasn't taking enough thyroid and I had flown from like I was away somewhere and then I came back, like the level of hypothyroidism was very noticeable when I first got here. And so but that was just adapting to the altitude, and I think I adapt way better when I come back here when I'm taking thyroid. And so but again, so much is different about being here that to say anything like because of the altitude is like way off, I think.
Sure, I'm just saying theoretically there seems to be a mismatch between the Ray Peat community's theory of higher altitude being better and the reality of those who have experienced it.
Did you get his last newsletter? Because he actually talked about it in a section. I don't really remember what he said, but he seemed to think that it was being the high altitude suicides and the things that people were saying were bad about high altitude were being spun in a certain way. He specifically addressed it in his last newsletter.
I will check it out.
Cool, man.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Take care.
Bye.
Okay, this is pretty fun. Do you want to take one or two more, and then we'll call it a night?
Yeah, whatever you want to do.
All right, okay, we'll do one more. Okay, but I guess that takes actually getting a call.
Oh yeah.
Okay, we have one more. Hello, you are on the air with Kyle and Danny. Who's this?
Oh, hi, Danny. Hi, Kyle. So Somo asked a question about fat oxidation earlier.
Oh, hey, brother.
So, yeah, it's like a follow-up question. So pretty much everything I've read would indicate that glucose oxidation is superior, but is fat oxidation like specifically bad for mitochondria? And what is it about lipolysis that's bad? And then like I'll take myself off the air.
Cool then. Thanks, man.
Thank you. Do you want to start on that one, or?
The main thing I can think of in my simple brain is the lipid peroxidation issue, but that is how I'd elevator pitch it. But what do you think?
Yeah. So related to that, but this is actually, it's a shame that we're not doing this next Friday because there's this talk that I'm actually going to go to and I'm kind of excited about at my school at UCF about oxidative and nitrosative damage of mitochondria. And this is actually one of the rare cases of mainstream, just completely like unassailable, normal, funded, and textbook research dovetailing really well with alternative health stuff. And it's that most of the science has been done in heart cells, and it has to do with like, myocyte and other cardiac cell damage in the mitochondria from the excessive presence in the membranes, those membranes we were talking about, of very long chain, highly unsaturated fatty acids. So basically, the actual oxidation of fats, it's not a problem, except that it changes the respiratory quotient. So insofar as CO2 is good and it reduces the ratio of CO2, like you have to inhale more oxygen to get the same CO2 production, that could be a problem. But in terms of real measurable problems, as you were mobilizing these fatty acids for oxidation, not all of them end up getting oxidized in the mitochondria for energy. Some of them, if they're highly unsaturated, can get, chemically, non-enzymatically oxidized outside of the cell or in the cell inappropriately, and that would be the peroxidation problem. But the worst thing that could happen is they get recruited to be part of the mitochondrial membrane. And then from there, they can get oxidized, but they even not oxidized in their virgin state. If there's a lot of them, they change the shape of the mitochondria because of their different electrostatic properties because of the double bonds, the presence of the double bonds. And the one talk that I saw years ago at Rutgers, the guy was specifically talking about like 22 or 24 carbon long, like super long PUFAs that are highly unsaturated, and that those cause serious problems when they reach a certain level in the mitochondrial membrane, even if they don't get oxidized. So it's kind of like mostly a side issue rather than the direct oxidation of fats being bad. It's the things that are associated with that, especially if they're polyunsaturated.
This paper, I grabbed it from somebody, but it was like PUFA and the mitochondrial cardiolipin are attacked by mitochondria-produced ROS. Cardiolipin is the most sensitive to ROS-induced peroxidation. This means that its peroxidation initiates a chain reaction, setting on fire other membrane constituents. Constituents, is that how you say that? But
Constituents.
Constituents. I mean, setting on fire, like setting the mitochondria on fire, I thought was like interesting imagery. But yeah.
Yeah. And so obviously you can't set something on fire that is not flammable. So the like implicit admission there, because you cannot peroxidize, you can't non-enzymatically oxidize saturated fatty acids at physiological temperature. There's too much of an energy barrier to that reaction. The attack of the alpha carbons on the acyl chain, it's too stable when it's saturated with hydrogens, because carbon and hydrogen share electrons very evenly, and carbon and oxygen do not. And that's so you can't. It's very hard to replace a hydrogen bond with a oxygen bond, and the only way you can do it is if there's usually unliganded iron as a catalyst, and those double bonds, because the bonds shared between two carbons on those pi orbitals, right? Forget about that. They're just less. They're more accessible to something that wants to abscond with them, either oxygen or some type of peroxy radical, an oxygenated species of something else.
Cool, brother. Should we put a fork in it? That is all I can think. Do you have anything to plug? Is there anything that you want to say?
I'm just looking at the chat real quick. What do you think of all the research coming out on DNP and its use as therapeutic recovery?
We can take one more call if you want.
I just wanted to look and make sure that there wasn't like some person that's like, I want to ask my question in the chat. DNP's been around like forever, right?
That the bodybuilder
The uncoupler
one, yeah. We had a question about that last time about because people are using super small amounts, and Georgie said he thought about it a ton of making a product with that, but it's just too risky, I think he said.
Yeah, that's one of those things that when I learned about it in like the like mainstream take on it is that it was dangerous, but the stories that they told were mostly people taking a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things where it hasn't been given the stamp of approval. So if you do take it, like if you were to sell it or if somebody takes it and something goes wrong, it's a lot bigger of a deal than if somebody takes an approved substance and something goes wrong, you know, even though that happens all the goddamn time.
Yeah.
So like, I can't really recommend it in any kind of responsible way, but from what I understand, there isn't like a direct damage route that I'm aware of at small amounts. I just know that people have been harmed by taking large amounts because it is effective. It burns up a ton of energy. It burns up a ton of calories. They don't have to do anything. They basically turn their bodies into like it's like, what is it? Jacob in Twilight, the werewolf people.
Sorry, Kyle, never seen it.
You haven't seen Twilight? Oh, I don't even know what team you're on. There's werewolves, and one of their defining features is that they have a really high metabolism. So they have to eat all the time. Like they're eating like 10,000 calories a day, these young men that can turn into huge, super strong wolves. And their body temperature is really high. It's like 103 or 105 or something all the time. So that's basically what you get from that drug, minus the werewolf.
Well, to my friend many years ago, probably honestly in 2012 or so, he wrote to Ray and he was like, what do you think the actual, I think he was talking about body temperature, but Ray wrote back saying that some kind of cell worked best when it was 99 and above. And so I think he was saying that it was good to get that body temperature up as high as. Also, this friend was taking 7 grams of aspirin, and he lived somewhere that was really cold, and he said he just didn't need a jacket anymore because the aspirin was caused that uncoupling effect of just throwing off tons of heat, I guess.
Yeah, that's a large amount. I guess he wasn't having.
He had HIV. He was like seriously ill at one point.
Did he have any of those supposed stomach problems like hemorrhage?
I've taken that much before. I haven't noticed any.
Yeah, I've taken a lot too. I haven't taken that much, but before, like, I bought a bottle of aspirin. Because when you buy aspirin, it doesn't have binders and all that other crap. It's a much higher dose because it's like pure aspirin.
Yeah.
When I first got into the Ray Peat stuff, I didn't realize the difference between like a normal person baby aspirin and this kind of stuff that you can buy that's like, this stuff I have, it's like geriatric aspirin or something. And the each pill is like 350 or so milligrams. Mm-hmm. And so I was taking like a gram at a sitting, like I'd take 3 of those. And I didn't realize that was like orders of magnitude more than if somebody just says, I'm going to take an aspirin. And I never had a bad reaction, but I didn't realize until later. I was like, oh, this is like a lot of aspirin, compared to what normal people think of when they think of an aspirin.
When people normally think of an aspirin, they're thinking of a baby aspirin, which is like 81 milligrams. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Yeah, that guy was the one that kind of got me to shed my aspirin fear. I'm sure I've talked about him on this, but he was using 7 grams, and there used to be a Facebook group with like 30 or 40 people in it, and he came into that group, and he was like, you guys are all like idiots. I've been studying Ray Peat's work since the 90s, and taking 7 grams saved my life, basically. Like the doctors said I was going to die, and I was on all those boutique HIV meds, and they said he just made him worse. And so I was always having problems with my temperature, and so at that time I was experimenting with thyroid, but I was like, oh, maybe the missing piece was aspirin. But I did a lot of stupid things, like I'd take the crystals orally, and those just like ripped up my stomach. They hurt like real bad. But if I dissolved it, I never had any problems.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you want to take another call, Kyle?
I mean, we could take one more. I'm fine with that.
Okay. Last call. We've been getting a bunch. I've just been ignoring them. I think I have to change this. Oh, here we go. Okay. Last call. Hey, what's up? You're on air with Kyle and Danny. Who's this?
Hey guys, my name's Alex. Thanks for the stream.
Yeah, no problem.
Just wondering if you had any cool anecdotal studies you've come across about honey and its hydrogen peroxide content in terms of maybe sterilizing the small intestine. And then also, I recently come across a study that said that honey contains some vitamin K2 homologs. Metoquinones. So I was wondering if you guys had any random thoughts about that.
Cool, brother. I haven't read about it at all.
Hydrogen peroxide. I've heard that that's in honey, but I don't know what the concentration is. I know that honey is definitely antibiotic when it's concentrated. I don't know how much that translates into when you eat it and it gets broken up into like in the digestive tract and stuff. People pack, like folk medicine, you would pack a wound with honey. And that was even more effective than, because packing a wound with anything that is like osmotically active is a reasonably good idea if you don't have anything better.
Cottonseed oil.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually have several experiences of putting raw honey in sort of wounds that I had. And if I did it prior to, like I had one on my face and I really didn't want it to scar. And so if I did it prior to it forming enough of a scab, it actually healed so much of the tissue that no scar was formed.
Nice.
Which was really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, seems like a good idea to me. Years ago, somebody said that for gut things, they were taking honey mixed with Ceylon cinnamon.
Oh yeah.
Worth a try.
And yeah, even just for the taste, sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I like alfalfa honey. I'm not a big fan of clover honey.
You know what was good in Southern California is that really raw honey brand. Did you ever try that before?
I have. That one's okay. I've had ones that I prefer.
Kyle, come on. Just okay. It's delicious.
They do have that alfalfa stuff, but when I was in New Jersey, there was like a local farm in South Jersey, and they had alfalfa, orange blossom. They had clover, which I didn't, I don't really like that, and wildflower. And it was that, that raw, unfiltered stuff that, like, if you turned the jar upside down, it wouldn't really fall. And that was nice.
Well, I was going to say, the only
I've
time
heard somewhere that
go ahead.
I've heard, I'm not sure about the actual chemical composition, but I've heard that the more crystallization, the higher the fructose content, and then maybe the more liquid, like still speaking of raw honey, the more liquid, maybe the more sucrose content, but I'm not sure what the ratios. I may have those reversed, but I think the fructose causes more crystallization.
I haven't heard. The only thing about identifying them is, I don't know if Ray said this, but somebody said that the darker it is, the more allergens it potentially has. And so that was the only thing I had to, because I like to use honey when I travel. And so it's like an easy way to bring a ton of sugar onto a plane, is getting like a thing of honey. Cool, brother.
Okay.
Anything else?
No. Thank you guys again.
Total pleasure. Take care. Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. I can't believe we've been streaming for 3 hours. That's ridiculous. Okay. Pull the cord on this. Kyle, any last parting words?
No, I'm just looking at the structure of honey. Or not honey, of fructose versus glucose, and trying to explain why it would make more crystals. We got this double bond here with the... it looks like glucose is more amphipathic, but I don't know. I'll have to look into that one. I'm always really curious about like chemistry questions like that.
Next episode is only on the structure of fructose. So we're just gonna go 3 hours on that. Cool, brother. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for joining me. I sincerely appreciate it. And thank you for everybody watching. Even though there was a disproportionate amount of sexual innuendo towards Kyle this entire episode, so I don't know what exactly to think about that per se, but Kyle, maybe you have an effect on people. But thanks again to Steph. Next week, Georgie and Emma Sarakis. I know the schedule is a little bit weird. But thank you guys so much. Sincerely appreciate it, and enjoy this sweet music. Bye, guys.
Bye.